Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Imagine, if you will, the final moments of a warrior's mortal life. He has fought for decades, perhaps centuries, across worlds whose names blur together in a haze of blood and gunsmoke. He has killed more enemies than most civilizations have produced soldiers. His body, already something more than human, something crafted and reshaped by genetic engineering and surgical augmentation into a living weapon, has finally reached the limit of what even transhuman biology can endure. His spine is shattered, his organs are failing, his twin hearts are stuttering in his chest like dying engines. Around him, the battle still rages, the screams of the enemy mingling with the bark of bolter fire and the distant rumble of artillery. His brothers are still fighting. The war is not over. It is never over. And as darkness closes in around the edges of his vision, as his enhanced physiology begins to lose its desperate battle against the wounds that have broken him beyond repair, a figure appears above him. An apothecary, perhaps, or a chaplain, their skull-faced helmet leaning close. And the words they speak are not last rites. They are not a farewell. They are a sentence, dressed in the language of honor. Brother, your service to the Emperor continues. In the grim darkness of the far future, even death is not an escape from duty. And for the greatest heroes of the Adeptus Astartes, for those space marines whose experience is deemed too valuable to lose, and whose warrior spirit burns too fiercely to be extinguished, there exists a fate that is simultaneously the highest honor and the most terrible punishment the Imperium of man can bestow. They will not be allowed to die. Instead, what remains of their broken, ruined bodies will be cut away, reduced to the barest essentials of organic life. The brain, a few vital organs, perhaps a fragment of torso, and sealed inside an armored sarcophagus, filled with cold, oily amniotic fluid. That sarcophagus will then be installed in the chest of a towering war machine, a walking fortress of adamantium and ceramite that stands several times the height of a man, bristling with weapons that can level buildings and crush tanks like empty cans. They will become a dreadnought, and they will never leave that metal shell again. Welcome back to Q on 40k. Tonight, we are going to spend some time together exploring one of the most haunting, most tragic, and most deeply fascinating concepts in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. We are going to talk about what it truly means to become a dreadnought. Not just the mechanical process, though we will cover that in vivid detail. Not just the different patterns and variants, though we will walk through every major type from the ancient Contemptor to the brutal new Redemptor. We are going to explore the full experience, from the moment a space marine falls on the battlefield to the centuries of half-life that follow. The slow erosion of memory and identity, the long sleeps between wars, the strange and terrible existence of being a consciousness trapped inside a walking tomb. We are going to meet the legendary dreadnoughts whose stories have shaped the history of the Imperium. Warriors like Bjorn the Fell-Handed, who has walked in his metal shell for over 10,000 years. And Rylanor, the Unyielding, who waited alone on a dead world for millennia just to strike one final blow against the monster who betrayed him. We are going to look at the dark mirror of the Chaos Dreadnought, where internment is not an honor, but a punishment, and the pilot's flesh slowly fuses with the machine in a nightmare of mutation and madness. And through all of it, we are going to grapple with the question that sits at the heart of the Dreadnought's existence. The question that makes these walking war machines so much more than just another unit on the battlefield. What does it mean to be alive when everything that made you human has been stripped away? So settle in, get comfortable. This is going to be a long one, and we have a lot of ground to cover. Let us begin at the beginning, in an age so distant that even the Imperium's most ancient records struggle to describe it clearly. The concept of the dreadnought, a walking war machine piloted by a wounded warrior sealed inside an armored shell, did not originate in the laboratories of Mars or the forges of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Its roots stretch back far deeper than that, into the murky, half-forgotten era known as the Dark Age of technology. This was a period spanning roughly from the 15th millennium to the 25th millennium, a golden age when humanity had spread across the stars, when artificial intelligences managed vast interstellar networks, and when the boundaries of science seemed limitless. During this era, the ancestors of what would eventually become the Mechanicum developed technologies so advanced that even 10,000 years later, the greatest minds of the Imperium can barely comprehend them, let alone replicate them. And among those technologies were the first walking combat platforms that would eventually evolve into the dreadnoughts we know today. Now, the specifics of those earliest designs have been almost entirely lost to time. The Age of Strife, that catastrophic period of warp storms, demonic incursions, and the collapse of interstellar civilization that followed the fall of the ancient Eldari Empire, destroyed most records of what came before. So what we do know is that when the Emperor of Mankind emerged from the shadows of old Earth to begin the Unification Wars, consolidating the fractured nations and techno-barbarian kingdoms of terror under his rule, he found proto-dreadnoughts already in use. These were crude things by later standards, walker platforms that bore little resemblance to the sleek Contemptors or the brutal Castroferum patterns that would come later. But the core concept was already there, a bipedal combat chassis capable of mounting heavy weapons and being controlled by a living pilot. What made these early walkers different from, say, an Imperial Knight or a Titan was the nature of the interface between pilot and machine. The dreadnought was not simply operated from a cockpit. The pilot was wired into the machine at a fundamental level, their nervous system linked to the walker's systems through a form of mind impulse unit that allowed them to control the dreadnought as naturally as they would their own body. In those earliest days, the pilot did not necessarily need to be wounded. The first edition of the Warhammer 40,000 rules described a version of the dreadnought where able-bodied warriors could be installed as pilots. But the interface was so immersive, so total in its replacement of the pilot's natural senses with the machine's artificial ones, that removing the pilot after extended use caused severe psychological damage. The dreadnought became an addiction of sorts, the pilot growing so dependent on their mechanical body that returning to their flesh felt like a kind of death. This detail has largely been retconned in later lore. But it speaks to something essential about the dreadnought concept that has remained consistent through every edition. The dreadnought is not simply armor, it is a replacement body, and once you enter it, you do not come back out the same person you were before, if you come out at all. During the Great Crusade, as the Emperor led his 20 Space Marine legions across the galaxy to reclaim the scattered worlds of humanity, the Dreadnought program was formalized and expanded. The Mechanicum of Mars, now allied with the Emperor through the Treaty of Mars, turned their formidable manufacturing capacity toward producing Dreadnought chassis in numbers sufficient to equip the Legion as Astartes. And it was during this period that the decision was made, likely by the Emperor himself, though the records are unclear, that Dreadnoughts would be reserved exclusively for Space Marines. The enhanced physiology of the Astartes, their superhuman resilience, their genetically modified brains capable of processing vast amounts of sensory data, made them uniquely suited to endure the stresses of Dreadnought internment. A baseline human simply could not survive the process. Their mind would break under the strain of controlling a body so much larger and more complex than the one nature had given them. Only a Space Marine had the mental and physical fortitude to interface with a dreadnought and retain their sanity, at least for a while. The most advanced dreadnought pattern of the Great Crusade era was the Contemptor. If you have ever seen images of these machines, you know why they are spoken of with such reverence, even 10 millennia later, or where the later Castroferum pattern would be boxy and utilitarian. All hard angles and exposed weapons mounts, the Contemptor was something almost elegant, taller and more humanoid in its proportions, with a rounded chassis and articulated limbs that allowed for a range of movement that no later dreadnought pattern would match. The Contemptor was a masterpiece of Imperial engineering. At its heart was an atomantic arc reactor, a power source so sophisticated that the knowledge to build new ones has been almost completely lost. This reactor not only powered the Contemptor's weapons and movement systems, but also generated a protective energy field that could deflect incoming fire, something that no standard dreadnought of the 41st Millennium can replicate. The Contemptor's sarcophagus was also more advanced than later designs, incorporating cybernetic systems that helped preserve the pilot's mental state and slow the degradation that comes with extended internment. A space marine sealed inside a Contemptor could remain lucid and functional for longer periods than one inside a castroferum, though even the Contemptor could not halt the process entirely. Nothing could. The mind was simply not designed to exist in a metal shell for centuries on end, no matter how sophisticated the technology that sustained it. Alongside the Contemptor, the Great Crusade saw the development of several other dreadnought patterns, each designed for a specific role on the battlefield. The Dreadnought was a dedicated heavy weapons platform, a walking gun emplacement that sacrificed close combat capability for devastating ranged firepower. Its advanced targeting systems, including the remarkable Aiolos missile launcher that could track targets independently of the main weapons and fire without requiring direct line of sight, made it one of the most feared support units in any Space Marine force. And then there was the Leviathan. The Leviathan pattern siege dreadnought deserves special attention because it represents something unusual in the history of Imperial technology, a weapon that was developed in secret on Terra, deliberately hidden from the Mechanicum of Mars. Its massive frame incorporated hybrid technologies that some believe dated back to the Age of Strife, and there were whispers that the Emperor himself had a hand in its design. The resources required to produce a single Leviathan were staggering, comparable to those needed to build an Imperial Knight. It towered over other dreadnought patterns, its oversized atomantic reactor powering weapons and energy fields that surpassed even the Contemptor. Storm cannons that could shred entire squads in a single burst. Cyclonic melter lances that could cut through the heaviest armor like a hot knife through butter. Siege claws and siege drills that could tear apart fortifications as easily as a man might rip through wet paper. But the Leviathan came with a terrible cost that went beyond its material requirements. The mechanisms that made it so powerful, the little understood systems that linked pilot to machine, placed a lethal level of strain on the minds of those interred within. Where other dreadnoughts would slowly erode their pilot's sanity over centuries, the Leviathan could break a mind in decades. The warriors sealed inside were driven to the edge of madness by the machine's dark dreaming, trapped in nightmares of the Horus Heresy that seemed to haunt the very chassis itself. Many suffered a final dissolution, their consciousness simply collapsing under the terrible strain. Because of this, the few Leviathans that survived into the 41st Millennium were rarely deployed. Only with the full authority of a chapter master could these terrifying machines be unleashed, and even then, where they struck and what they killed was as often determined by their own dark dreams as by the will of their commanders. The Mechanicum, it should be noted, was deeply uneasy about the Leviathan, not just because of its devastating psychological effects on its pilots, but because they saw in its design a weapon purpose-built to match and destroy their own battle automata. Some among the tech priests believed the Emperor had created the Leviathan as an insurance policy, a weapon to be used against Mars itself, should the alliance between Terra and the Mechanicum ever fracture. Whether this was true or mere paranoia has never been confirmed, but the suspicion speaks volumes about the relationship between the Emperor and his allies on Mars, a relationship that was always more pragmatic than trusting, more necessary than warm. All of this, the elegant Contemptors, the devastating Dreadnoughts, the terrifying Leviathans, was made possible by an industrial base and a body of technical knowledge that the Imperium would never again possess, because the Horus Heresy was coming, and in its wake, it would destroy not just half the Emperor's legions, but the very ability to create the tools that those legions had wielded. The galaxy was about to burn, and the flames would consume knowledge that could never be recovered. But before we talk about what was lost, we need to talk about something even more fundamental. We need to talk about what it actually means, physically and psychologically, for a space marine to be placed inside one of these machines. We need to talk about the internment itself, because the process of becoming a dreadnought is not simply a medical procedure. It is, in many ways, a kind of death. The man who goes into the sarcophagus is not the same entity that wakes up inside the machine. Something is lost in the translation, something that can never be recovered, and understanding what that something is, and understanding the full horror and the full tragedy of the transformation is essential to understanding why the dreadnought is not just a weapon of war, but one of the most powerful symbols in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The journey toward becoming a dreadnought always begins the same way. It begins with a wound. Not just any wound, of course. Space Marines are extraordinarily difficult to kill. Their genetically modified bodies can survive injuries that would kill a baseline human several times over. They have redundant organs, enhanced clotting factors, the ability to enter a state of suspended animation when critically injured. Their power armor itself is equipped with systems that can inject stimulants, seal breaches, and administer first aid automatically. And behind all of this stands the chapter's apothecaries, a highly trained medical specialists who can perform feats of surgery that would be considered miraculous by the standards of civilian imperial medicine. So when we say that a space marine has been wounded beyond recovery, we are talking about damage so catastrophic that it has overwhelmed every one of these failsafes. We are talking about a warrior whose spine has been shattered, whose organs have been pulped, whose limbs have been torn away, who has perhaps been exposed to exotic weapons or xenos poisons that are actively consuming what remains of his body. We are talking about someone who, by any reasonable definition, should be dead, and who would be dead if not for the stubborn refusal of his enhanced biology to give up entirely. There is still a spark of life in the broken shell. The brain still functions, or can be made to function, yet the twin hearts still beat, however weakly. And that spark, that tiny guttering flame of consciousness in a body that is otherwise a ruin, is what the Dreadnought program is designed to preserve. The decision to enter a space marine in a dreadnought is not made lightly. It is not an automatic process, not something that happens to every mortally wounded battle brother. The technology to build new dreadnought chassis has been almost entirely lost, which means that every dreadnought in a chapter's armory is an irreplaceable relic, some of them thousands of years old, their components maintained and repaired by generations of tech marines who understand only a fraction of the science behind their construction. A chapter might possess only a handful of empty sarcophagi at any given time, waiting for pilots. And the decision of who is worthy to fill one is made by the chapter master himself, in consultation with the chief apothecary and the chaplain of the company in which the fallen brother served. The criteria are rigorous. The wounded Marine must be a veteran of exceptional skill and experience. His tactical knowledge, his battlefield wisdom, his very identity as a warrior must be deemed too valuable to lose. The rank-and-file battle brother, no matter how bravely he fought, no matter how grievous his wounds, will typically be granted the mercy of final death rather than the dubious honor of interment. It is the captains, the sergeants, the chapter heroes, the warriors whose sagas are already written into the chapter's history, who are chosen for this fate. In theory, it is a mark of supreme respect, a declaration that this individual's contribution to the chapter and to the Emperor is so significant that his service must continue even beyond the death of his mortal body. In practice, of course, it is something considerably more complicated than that, because the Marine himself is rarely consulted. He lies on the apothecary's table, broken and barely conscious, while others decide his fate. And even if he were asked, even if he were given a choice, what would he say? He has been raised from childhood in a culture that values duty above all else, that teaches him that his body belongs not to himself, but to the Emperor, that to refuse a command from his chapter master is unthinkable. He might feel dread at the prospect of being sealed inside a metal shell for eternity. He might prefer the clean finality of death, but he would not, I could not, say so. The weight of 10,000 years of tradition would close his mouth for him. So the apothecaries go to work, and what they do is not gentle. First, everything that is not essential to maintaining consciousness is removed. The damaged limbs, if any remain, are amputated. The ruined organs that are not critical to sustaining brain function are cut away. What is left of the Marine's body is reduced to its absolute minimum. A tightly curled remnant of flesh centered around the brain and whatever vital organs are needed to keep it alive. This remnant, this shriveled core of what was once a superhuman warrior, is then surgically implanted into the cybernetic sarcophagus that will be its home for the rest eternity. The sarcophagus itself is a marvel of engineering, and though the word marvel feels inadequate and perhaps even cruel in this context. It is an armored container roughly the size and shape of a large coffin, lined with life support systems that will sustain the pilot's biological functions indefinitely. The interior is filled with amniotic fluid, a thick, oily substance that is described in the lore as being numbingly cold. This fluid fills the pilot's lungs as they breathe, sustaining them in a way that air alone no longer can. It preserves the remaining organic tissue, slows degradation, and provides a medium through which nutrients and medications can be delivered directly to the pilot's body. But the amniotic fluid is more than just a preservation medium. It is also the interface through which the pilot connects to the Dreadnought systems, and cybernetic implants are threaded through the pilot's remaining nervous system, connecting their brain to the machine through a network of neural relays and a mind impulse unit. These connections allow the pilot to perceive the world through the Dreadnought's sensors, to hear through its audio pickups, to see through its optical arrays. They allow the pilot to move the Dreadnought's limbs as naturally as they once moved their own, to aim and fire its weapons with the same instinctive precision they once brought to a bolter or a chainsword. The lore describes this sensory replacement in unsettling detail. The stabbing input cords that connect the pilot to the machine, the way the pilot must focus on controlling the Dreadnought, because if their mind returns to its natural state of awareness, thus it will center on their butchered and crippled physical body, on the horror of what they have become. The pilot does not see the world directly. They perceive it through data feeds, through Auspex scanners and targeting arrays, through acoustic sensors that translate sound into information rather than experience. Touch becomes pressure readings on the armor plating. Smell becomes chemical analysis readouts. The warmth of sunlight, the feel of rain, the sensation of another person's hand on your shoulder, all of these things are gone forever, replaced by cold, clinical data. And then there is the voice. The Dreadnought's communication systems translate the pilot's thoughts and emotions into a simulated vocalization that is only loosely reminiscent of the voice they had in life. It is a synthesized, crackling thing, harsh and mechanical, emanating from speakers in the Dreadnought's hull. Speaking with a Dreadnought is described as an eerie experience, like conversing with a ghost trapped inside a machine. There are even quirks in the system, little glitches where the translation between thought and sound goes slightly wrong. Laughter, for instance, might be rendered as the cycling of autocannon rounds, a deeply unsettling detail that speaks to how thoroughly the machine has replaced the man. The entire process of internment, from the initial surgery to the final activation of the Dreadnought systems, takes several days at minimum. And when it is complete, when the sarcophagus is sealed, and the Dreadnought's reactor hums to life, and the pilot opens his new mechanical eyes for the first time, what he sees is a world that he will never again touch with human hands. And what he hears is a world filtered through speakers and sensors, What he feels is the cold weight of adamantium and ceramite, the hum of servos, the distant throb of a reactor that is now, in a very real sense, his heart. He is alive. But the life he now lives is something that the word life barely begins to describe. Traditionally, every dreadnought bears a scroll on its sarcophagus, inscribed with the name of the hero resting within. When a new warrior is interred, the dreadnought takes a new name, a rebirth of sorts, though what exactly is being reborn is open to interpretation. The pilot is both more and less than what they were before. More in the sense that they now possess the strength to crush a battle tank with one hand, the firepower to level a city block, as the durability to shrug off weapons that would destroy a mortal warrior a dozen times over. Less in the sense that everything else, every soft and human thing, the taste of food, the feeling of brotherhood that comes from standing shoulder to shoulder with your squad, the simple pleasure of breathing real air, is gone. The Imperium calls this an honor, the greatest honor a chapter can bestow upon one of its fallen heroes. And for many of the Marines who undergo the process, particularly in the immediate aftermath of their interment, they try to believe it. They are Space Marines. They have been trained since childhood to accept the dictates of their superiors without question, to embrace suffering as a form of devotion, to see their own bodies as tools of the Emperor's will rather than as something belonging to themselves. Yet if their chapter master says that this is an honor, then it is an honor. If the chaplain says that their service continues, then it continues. Questioning this would be tantamount to heresy, a rejection of everything they have been taught to believe. But deep in the cold darkness of the sarcophagus, in the silence between battles when there is nothing to do but think, the doubt creeps in. And the doubt has centuries to grow. Because the battle, terrible as it is actually the easy part. The battle is the one time when a dreadnought feels something approaching purpose, when the weapons sing and the enemy falls and there is, however briefly, a sense that this existence has meaning. The hard part is what comes after. The hard part is the silence, the waiting, the long, long sleep. When a dreadnought is not needed on the battlefield, it is returned to the chapter's fortress monastery, to the sacred halls deep beneath the surface where the chapter's dreadnoughts are stored between conflicts. These halls are quiet, reverential places, maintained by tech marines who treat the sleeping dreadnoughts with almost religious devotion, anointing their sarcophagi with sacred oils and murmuring prayers to the machine spirits that supposedly dwell within the mechanical forms. Brother Space Marines visit these halls to pay their respects, standing in silent vigil before the slumbering ancients as they would before a shrine. The dreadnoughts themselves are placed in stasis, a form of suspended animation that slows biological processes to a crawl and puts the pilot's consciousness into something resembling sleep. But it is not true sleep, not the restful, dreaming sleep of a living being. The lore describes it as something closer to a void, an absence of sensation so complete that when consciousness returns, the pilot sometimes wonders if they ever existed at all. Time passes, but it does not pass the way it does for the living. Years, decades, even centuries can slide by in what feels like a single moment of darkness, or conversely, a single night of stasis can stretch out into what feels like an eternity of nothing. And when the dreadnought is finally awakened, when the tech priests gather around the sarcophagus and begin the activation rituals and the systems slowly come back online, the pilot's first sensation is always the same: disorientation, confusion, a desperate search for the body they no longer have, for the hands that are now weapons, for the voice that is now a mechanical rasp. They reach for memories and find them faded, like old photographs left in the sun. They try to remember the faces of their battle brothers and find only blurred outlines where sharp features used to be. They try to recall the sound of their own voice and hear only the synthesized crackle of the dreadnought speakers. This is the phenomenon that the lore describes with clinical precision. Extended neural interface with a vehicle as large and complex as a dreadnought, causes immense mental stress on the occupant, creating conditions such as lethargy, confusion, a distorted sense of time called dyschronometria, and even senility. Each awakening takes the pilot further from what they were. Each period of stasis erodes a little more of their personality, a little more of their memories, and a little more of the human being they used to be. The organic components of the brain, the parts that store emotional memories and personal identity, degrade over time in ways that the life support systems cannot fully prevent. What remains becomes increasingly mechanical, increasingly defined by tactical data and combat protocols, rather than by the lived experience of a thinking, feeling being. Some pilots handle this better than others. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the oldest living dreadnought in the Imperium, has maintained his lucidity for over 10,000 years, though even he admits that the loneliness cuts deeper than any blade. His sullen, bitter temperament, a personality trait that predated his internment, seems to have actually helped preserve his sanity, and his cold anger providing an emotional anchor that keeps him tethered to himself even across the millennia. Others are not so fortunate. The Space Wolf's Murderfang, for instance, has lost all trace of his original identity. The name of the hero who once piloted that dreadnought is gone, consumed by whatever bestial madness now animates the machine. The chapter keeps Murderfang chained in a glacial prison deep beneath their fortress, releasing him only in times of desperate need, when they require pure, unthinking violence. He attacks friend and foe alike, a berserker trapped in an adamantium shell, and the moment the battle is over, he is chained again, locked away before he can turn on his own brothers. Between these two extremes, between Bjorn's grim lucidity and Murderfang's total dissolution, lies the experience of most dreadnoughts. At a slow, steady decline. A gradual loss of self that can take centuries to complete, but that begins from the very first moment of awakening. The pilot remembers less with each cycle of sleep and waking. The faces of comrades blur and fade. The details of past battles dissolve into statistical data, dry numbers stripped of emotional context. The pilot begins to confuse the present with the past, to speak of battles that happened millennia ago as if they were yesterday, to address living Marines by the names of brothers who have been dead for centuries. The Death Watch, that specialized force of space Marines drawn from multiple chapters to fight against Xenos threats, has produced its own dreadnoughts over the millennia, and their records note this decline with particular clarity. The process of becoming a dreadnought, they write, combined with extended periods of inactivity, diminishes the interred warrior's mind, wearing away memories and jumbling those that remain. A newly interred dreadnought might be sharp and focused, but give it a few centuries and the erosion becomes unmistakable. Consider what this means. A space marine is already something other than human. He has been modified at the genetic level, his body enhanced with additional organs, his mind conditioned through decades of training and indoctrination. He has given up family, comfort, pleasure, everything that defines a normal human life in service to the Emperor. And now, in being interred within a dreadnought, he gives up even the remnants of his physical existence. His body is reduced to a fragment. His senses are replaced by data feeds. His voice is translated through speakers. And then, one by one, his memories begin to go. His personality begins to fade. The man inside the machine becomes less and less of a man, and more of a weapon with a flickering consciousness. This is the true horror of the dreadnought. Not the physical transformation, terrible as it is. Not the loss of the body. Not the sensory deprivation. Not even the endless cycles of battle and sleep. The true horror is the slow, irreversible loss of self. The knowledge that with each passing century, you are becoming less of who you were and more of what they made you. That eventually, perhaps inevitably, there will come a day when the machine is all that remains, and the man who once piloted it is nothing but a name on a scroll and a fading echo in the memory banks. and yet they endure. Century after century, millennium after millennium, the dreadnoughts of the Adeptus, Astartes continue to serve. They wake when called, they fight when needed, they offer what wisdom remains to them when asked, and then they sleep again, returning to the void, waiting for the next war, the next awakening, the next slow step in the long march toward the final dissolution of everything they once were. It is simultaneously the most noble and the most terrible fate in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And it is why, for all their firepower and their armor and their devastating effectiveness on the battlefield, dreadnoughts are more than just war machines. They are monuments to sacrifice. They are walking memorials to the cost of eternal war. And they are, in their own way, the most human things in the entire Imperium. And because they remind us what humanity is by showing us what it looks like to lose it, one memory at a time. Now, let us talk about the machines themselves, because not all dreadnoughts are created equal. Over the course of 10,000 years of warfare, the Imperium has fielded a remarkable variety of dreadnought patterns and variants, each designed for a specific purpose, each with its own strengths and limitations, each with its own history and its own legacy of blood. The most common dreadnought pattern in service during the 41st millennium is the Castroferum. If you have ever seen a Warhammer 40,000 miniature or played the Space Marine video games, this is almost certainly the dreadnought you picture when you hear the word. It is the iconic box, that angular, broad-shouldered silhouette with its weapon arms and its slab-sided hull, looking like someone took a tank and decided it should have legs. The Castroferum is not elegant. It is not sleek. It does not look like it was designed by an artist. It looks like it was designed by an engineer who had been told to make something that could survive a direct hit from an anti-tank missile and still keep walking, and who achieved that goal with ruthless efficiency and absolutely zero concern for aesthetics. The Castroferum pattern, also designated the Mars pattern in its most common Mark IV and Mark V variants, was developed by the Mechanicum during the Great Crusade, specifically for its compact size and adaptable design. While the Contemptor was taller and more agile, the Castroferum was shorter, squatter, and specifically designed for tactical situations where that lower profile was an advantage: direct assaults, boarding actions, tunnel fighting, and subterranean combat. Where the Contemptor relied on the sophisticated and increasingly irreplaceable atomantic arc reactor for its power, the Castroferum used an adaptable thermic reactor, a simpler and more robust power source that, critically, could actually be maintained and occasionally even replicated by the tech priests of the 41st millennium. This practical advantage is the primary reason the Castroferum became the standard dreadnought pattern, while the more advanced Contemptor faded into extreme rarity. It was not that the Castroferum was better, it was that the Imperium could still keep it running. A standard Castroferum dreadnought is armored in layers of ceramite and adamantium, the same materials used in Space Marine power armor, but applied in much greater thickness. Its muscles, the mechanical systems that allow it to move, are formed of electro-fiber bundles and magna coils, giving it strength far beyond what any organic creature could match. Despite its bulk, it is surprisingly agile, able to walk and balance with the ease of a living creature, thanks to the neural link between the pilot and the machine's motor systems. The pilot's thoughts become the dreadnought's movements, and after centuries of practice, this control becomes so refined that some dreadnought pilots can perform feats of dexterity that seem impossible for a machine of that size. The Castroferum's weapon loadout is designed to be modular, adaptable to the needs of the mission. One arm typically mounts a close combat weapon, a massive dreadnought-sized power fist capable of crushing reinforced concrete to powder, often with an underslung heavy flamer or stormbolter for dealing with infantry at close range. The other arm mounts a ranged weapon, and the options here are extensive. Assault cannons for shredding light vehicles and infantry, twin-linked las cannons for penetrating heavy armor at range, multi-melters for getting up close and vaporizing anything with a thick hull, missile launchers for flexible fire support at varying distances, plasma cannons for when you need something that combines range with raw destructive power. This modularity means that a single Dreadnought chassis can be configured for almost any battlefield role. And from anti-infantry to anti-armor to siege operations, and a chapter's tech marines can swap weapons between engagements to match the expected threat. The Castraferum also comes in several specialized variants that deserve mention. The ironclad Dreadnought adds additional armor plating to the front of the chassis, making it even more resistant to enemy fire at the cost of some weapon flexibility. It is designed for leading assault operations, for being the first thing through the breach when a chapter needs to storm a fortified position. The Siege Dreadnought takes this concept even further, equipped with heavy flamers and close combat weapons specifically designed for tearing apart fortifications. The Hellfire Dreadnought focuses on ranged firepower, often mounting twin-linked lascannons and missile launchers for long-range fire support. Then there is the Venerable Dreadnought. This is not technically a different pattern, but rather a designation given to the oldest and most experienced Dreadnought pilots in a chapter's roster. A Venerable Dreadnought has fought in thousands of battles over centuries or even millennia, accumulating a vast store of tactical knowledge and battlefield wisdom. Some of these warriors have memories that extend back to the founding of their chapter, making them living links to an era that every other Marine knows only from legends and scripture. The respect afforded to a Venerable Dreadnought is immense. From the lowliest initiate to the chapter master himself, every warrior in the chapter will eventually seek out the counsel of these ancients. Their sarcophagi are maintained with religious devotion, their weapons kept in perfect condition, as their sleeping chambers treated as sacred shrines. The irony, of course, is that the very age that makes a Venerable Dreadnought so respected is also what erodes the mind within.
Now, I want to take a quick second here to just share something personal. Because out of everything in the entire setting, the Dreadnought is the one concept that genuinely unsettles me. Not the Tyranids, not the Warp, not even Chaos Corruption. It is this, the idea that the reward for being the best, for giving everything you have, is that you never get to stop. You never get to rest. They seal you in a box and they wake you up every few decades to do it all over again. And everyone around you calls it an honor while you are screaming inside a metal coffin. That messes with me. And honestly, I think that is why so many of us are drawn to the Dreadnought stories. It is not just cool lore, it hits something real. That fear of being used by the things you are loyal to. Of giving so much of yourself that there's nothing left but the job. But anyways, that was just my 2 cents. Let's keep going.
The oldest Dreadnoughts are often the most confused, the most prone to disorientation upon awakening, the most likely to mistake the present for the distant past. Their tactical knowledge is there, preserved in the mechanical portions of their memory, but the human context that once gave that knowledge meaning may have faded beyond recovery. A Venerable Dreadnought might be able to recite the tactical dispositions of a battle fought 3,000 years ago with perfect accuracy, but be unable to remember the name of the chapter master who currently leads them. Now, let us step back in time again and talk about the Contemptor in more detail. One, because understanding this pattern is essential to understanding the tragedy of the Imperium's technological decline. The Contemptor pattern. Dreadnought was the gold standard during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. It stood taller than the Castraferum, with a more humanoid silhouette, and a design philosophy that prioritized both protection and mobility. Its atomantic arc reactor was more powerful than anything the Castraferum would carry, and its atomantic shielding could deflect incoming fire in a way that no modern dreadnought can replicate. Its servo systems were superior, giving it faster reaction times and more fluid movement. Its weapon options were more exotic, including the Keres pattern assault cannon, considered by some tech savants to be the ancestor of the modern Terminator assault cannon, as well as compact plasma blasters and graviton guns, whose secrets were lost during the Schism of Mars. During the Great Crusade, the Contemptor served alongside the Castraferum as a spearhead unit for the Space Marine legions. During the Horus Heresy and the wars that followed, they bore the heaviest fighting in every theatre and suffered accordingly devastating losses. And in the chaotic aftermath of the heresy, when the Imperium was fractured and bleeding, when the knowledge of 1,000 technologies was being lost in the flames of civil war, the ability to manufacture and maintain the Contemptor was essentially destroyed. There are reports of Contemptor pattern dreadnoughts being fielded by first founding chapters as late as the 36th millennium, but by the 41st millennium. While they are incredibly rare relics of a lost age, a chapter that possesses even a single functional Contemptor guards it jealously, deploying it only in the most desperate circumstances, knowing that any damage it suffers may be irreparable. The Space Wolves had a particularly uneasy relationship with the Contemptor. Within their legion, these machines developed a reputation for excess savagery on the battlefield, and the chapter's superstitious Iron Priests began selectively interring only those Marines who already had dark deeds in their sagas, creating a self-fulfilling cycle of violence and infamy. This is partly why Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the oldest living Space Wolf and arguably the most famous dreadnought in the Imperium, was interred in a Mark V Castroferum rather than a Contemptor. The Wolves preferred the reliability and the less troublesome reputation of the standard pattern, even at the cost of the Contemptor's superior capabilities. Beyond the Contemptor and the Castroferum, the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy era produced the Dreadnought pattern, which we have already mentioned. Its role as a dedicated heavy weapons platform set it apart from the general-purpose Contemptor and the assault-oriented Castroferum. The Dreadnought shared many core components with the Contemptor, but was designed around a single philosophy: put as much firepower downrange as possible from the most durable platform available. Its anvilous autocannon batteries could punch through medium armor at range. Its Aiolos missile launcher could engage targets behind cover. And its torso-mounted weapons provided close defense against infantry that managed to get within range. For a Legion commander who needed a firebase that could survive counter-battery fire and keep shooting no matter what was thrown at it, the Dreadnought was the answer. The most recently revealed pattern from this era is the Saturnine. Developed from technology originating in a banished Mechanicum tech cabal on Saturn's moon of Phoebe, the same enclave that created the Saturnine pattern Terminator armor, this dreadnought was originally too technically complex for mass production. It was the Primarch Vulcan of the Salamanders who revived the design and figured out how to get it into production in meaningful numbers, sharing his knowledge with the other legions. The Saturnine was enormous, towering even over the Leviathan, with thicker armor, was more powerful generators, stronger energy fields, and weaponry that included heavy plasma bombards and disintegration cannons. It even incorporated teleportation synchronizers into its shoulder mounts, giving it the unprecedented ability to be teleported directly into combat. Rumors suggest that piloting a Saturnine required not just exceptional willpower and discipline, but possibly some degree of psychic talent to access the armor's full capabilities. The arrival of this pattern expanded the already formidable arsenal available to the Legiones Astartes, but like so many technologies of that era, the knowledge to build new Saturnines would not survive the heresy intact. Now, let us jump forward 10,000 years and talk about the newest addition to the Dreadnought family, and a pattern that represents both the most significant technological advancement in Dreadnought design in millennia and one of the most controversial decisions in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. The Redemptor Dreadnought. The Redemptor was created as part of Belisarius Caul's sweeping program of military innovation that also produced the Primaris Space Marines, the new generation of Astartes who are bigger, stronger, and more heavily equipped than their firstborn predecessors. Like the Primaris Marines themselves, the Redemptor is larger and more powerful than the Dreadnought patterns that came before it. It stands taller than a Castroferum, with a broader chassis, more sophisticated fiber bundles for movement, and a hyper-dense plasma reactor that powers weapon systems of devastating potency. Or one arm mounts either a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, a rotary weapon that can chew through a squad of heretic Astartes in a single pass, or a macroplasma incinerator, a gun that harnesses the heat of captive suns to melt enemy tanks into slag. The other arm bears a massive Redemptor fist, a power fist so large and so powerful that it can punch through the hull of a battle tank or tear the leg from a Chaos Knight. The Redemptor's neural links are described as miraculously advanced, allowing its pilot to exercise control with surprising dexterity and speed, despite being entombed in the sarcophagus within the Dreadnought's chest. It can accelerate from a walking pace to a thunderous, ground-shaking charge that barrels through enemy fire with glorious defiance. On the tabletop, whilst the Redemptor is one of the most popular and effective Dreadnought variants, combining excellent firepower with reasonable durability and surprising mobility. But here is the dark side of Call's creation, the price that is paid for all that power. The Mechanicum tech priests who designed the Redemptor spared, and this is a direct quote from the official lore, little thought to the health of the incumbent, seeing him as little more than another part to be interred or replaced as necessary. The Redemptor's systems place an enormous strain on the pilot, far greater than what a traditional castroferum imposes. Where a marine interred in a castroferum can endure for centuries, potentially millennia, the pilot of a Redemptor burns out. The machine's surging energies leach the occupant's life force, and after a sustained period of operation, the original pilot simply gives out. In the worst cases, the pilot is reduced to nothing but a sack of blackened organs, their life force completely drained by the machine they were supposed to control. The sarcophagus is then replaced, a new pilot installed, and the Redemptor marches to war once more with a fresh victim in its chest. Many Redemptors that have seen sustained combat have already had their sarcophagi replaced multiple times. This is a Dreadnought that does not preserve its pilot for eternity, but consumes them, burning through warriors like fuel. Where the traditional Dreadnought was a tomb that at least offered the possibility of indefinite service, the Redemptor is something closer to an execution device with a delay timer. The pilot will die inside the machine, and the only question is how long they have before the machine finishes draining them. This represents a fundamental philosophical departure from the original purpose of the Dreadnought program. The whole point, at least in theory, was to preserve the experience and wisdom of the chapter's greatest heroes. A venerable Dreadnought that has served for 5,000 years carries 5,000 years of tactical knowledge and battlefield wisdom in its memory banks. A Redemptor pilot who burns out after a few decades carries almost nothing. The Redemptor is a weapon that treats its pilot as disposable, a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. It is, in a very real sense, the Mechanicum's view of human life made manifest, the belief that the machine matters more than the person inside it. The Redemptor has spawned its own subvariants that share this same troubling design philosophy. The Brutalis Dreadnought is a Redemptor configured for close combat, its arms replaced with massive talons or fists, equipped with built-in bolt rifles, its chassis mounted with heavy stubbers and multi-melters. It is a purebred assault weapon, designed for maximum shock and carnage, and like all Primaris marine dreadnoughts, its high performance comes at the expense of the pilot within, whose damaged form is slowly burned out by the strain of operating such a powerful machine. The Ballistus Dreadnought takes the opposite approach, configured for ranged combat with weapons designed to engage targets at distance, while the chassis provides a stable and well-armored firing platform. But the fundamental bargain is the same: any power in exchange for the pilot's life, capability in exchange for the humanity of the warrior inside. There is something deeply unsettling about the Redemptor when you compare it to the ancient Contemptor. The Contemptor, for all its power, was designed with the pilot's well-being in mind. Its atomantic shielding protected both the machine and the man inside. Its advanced sarcophagus included systems specifically intended to slow the mental degradation that comes with internment. It was a machine built with at least some consideration for the person trapped within. The Redemptor, by contrast, is a machine built by an institution that has long since stopped caring about individuals and now cares only about output. The Mechanicum does not see a hero entombed, it sees a component installed. And when that component burns out, it is replaced. Just as you would replace a spent power cell or a worn gear. This is the Imperium of man in microcosm, a civilization that claims to honor its heroes while simultaneously consuming them. A culture that speaks of duty and sacrifice while treating its greatest warriors as expendable resources. The Redemptor Dreadnought is not just a war machine. It is a statement about what 10,000 years of decline and desperation have done to the soul of humanity's empire. But the Dreadnought patterns available to the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes are only part of the story. Several chapters have developed their own unique variants, adapted to their particular gene seed, their particular culture, and their particular style of warfare. And these chapter-specific dreadnoughts add layers of complexity and tragedy to an already complex and tragic concept. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters field. What is perhaps the most disturbing variant of the standard dreadnought, the Furioso. The Furioso replaces the single long-range weapon of a standard dreadnought with a second close combat weapon, creating a machine that is designed entirely around the concept of getting into melee range and tearing the enemy apart with both hands. The Blood Angels version uses specialized weapons called Blood Fists and Blood Talons, massive clawed gauntlets that can shred even heavily armored opponents. The Furioso also has access to the Magna Grapple, a magnetic weapon that can pull enemy vehicles closer, and the Frag Cannon, or a devastating short-range weapon that blasts enemy positions with a wall of shrapnel. The Furioso is terrifying enough on its own, but the Blood Angels have a genetic curse running through their gene seed, a flaw inherited from their Primarch Sanguinius that manifests in two forms: the Red Thirst, an insatiable craving for blood that can overwhelm a Marine's discipline, and the Black Rage, a psychic echo of Sanguinius's death at the hands of Horus during the Horus Heresy, that plunges the affected Marine into a hallucinatory state where they believe they are their Primarch, reliving his final battle. Marines who succumb to the Black Rage are inducted into the Death Company, a unit of doomed warriors who are given black armor and sent on suicide missions, fighting with berserk fury until they are killed. And sometimes, as a dreadnought pilot succumbs to the Black Rage, the result is a Death Company dreadnought, a machine animated by a consciousness that has been completely consumed by 10,000-year-old rage and grief. The pilot believes he is Sanguinius. He believes he is fighting Horus. He attacks everything in his path with the fury of a demigod, reliving the worst moment in his legion's history. Death Company dreadnoughts are always armed for close combat, because giving a berserk dreadnought long-range weapons would risk it firing on friendly forces. They are unleashed against enemy positions deemed too dangerous for any other unit, let loose to wreak havoc until they are either destroyed or the battle is over. The first Death Company dreadnought was Morleo Moriar, a captain of the Blood Angels' 4th Company, who was interred in a Furioso chassis and immediately, upon awakening in his new body, experienced a vision of Sanguinius and was lost to the Black Rage forever. He is now known as Moriar the Chosen, and he fights alongside the Blood Angels' Death Company to this day, trapped in an endless nightmare of rage and grief. The Blood Angels can also field Librarian Dreadnoughts, a vanishingly rare variant that occurs when a Blood Angels Librarian, one of the chapter's psychers, is critically wounded and interred in a Dreadnought chassis. These machines are outfitted with psychic hoods built into the sarcophagus and equipped with a force weapon, usually a massive force halberd, in place of one of the Furioso's close combat weapons. As a Librarian Dreadnought retains the ability to wield its psychic powers from within the machine, channeling the energies of the warp through the Dreadnought's hull with devastating effect. They are among the rarest units in the entire Blood Angels chapter, but when they take the field, they combine the raw physical power of a Dreadnought with the terrifying abilities of a Psyker in a package that few enemies can withstand. The Grey Knights, that most secretive of chapters, whose every Marine is a sanctioned Psyker, field their own Dreadnought variant, known as the Doomglaive. The Doomglaive's sarcophagus incorporates cyber circuitry that can link its Aegis field to the psychic defenses deployed by nearby Grey Knights, yet creating a network of reinforced psychic wards that is far stronger than what any individual Grey Knight can project alone. It is a dreadnought designed not just for physical combat, but for psychic warfare. A walking fortress that can anchor an entire force's mental defenses while simultaneously engaging the enemy with conventional weapons. The Space Wolves, in addition to Bjorn the Fell-Handed and the standard Dreadnought variants, have the distinction of fielding the Wolfen Dreadnought. The Wolfen are Space Wolves who have been overwhelmed by the Canis Helix, the unique genetic quirk of the Space Wolves' gene seed that gives them their enhanced senses and their wolf-like features. When the Canis Helix takes full hold, the affected Marine transforms into something bestial, more wolf than man, consumed by animal fury. But when a Wolfen is mortally wounded and interred in a Dreadnought, the result is a machine animated by pure predatory instinct, a Wolfen Dreadnought that fights with savage animal aggression. Murderfang, whom we discussed earlier, is the most extreme example of this phenomenon. Found roaming a hellworld called Omnicide, clearly a Dreadnought of Space Wolf design, but with its pilot's identity entirely consumed by the Wolfen transformation, Murderfang represents the absolute bottom of what can happen when a consciousness trapped inside a Dreadnought loses all contact with its former self. Not confusion, not senility, complete dissolution. The man is gone. Only the beast remains. The Dark Angels field the Mortis Dreadnought is a pattern optimized for long-range fire support with twin-linked weapons on both arms and advanced targeting arrays capable of engaging aircraft. The Chaplain Dreadnought is used by several chapters and is exactly what it sounds like. A Dreadnought whose pilot was a chaplain before his mortal wounding and who continues to fulfill that spiritual role from within his armored shell, leading the faithful in prayer and exhortation even as he crushes the enemy beneath his power fist. The ironclad Dreadnought adds extra armor at the cost of weapon versatility, turning the Dreadnought into a battering ram designed to lead the charge into the most heavily defended positions. And then there are the Dreadnoughts of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, warriors who are to Space Marines what Space Marines are to baseline humans. At the Custodes field, the Contemptor Galatus, a variant armed with a massive shield and a great sword, designed for the close-quarters combat that is the Custodes' specialty. The Contemptor Achilles swaps the shield and sword for a massive power spear called the Dread Spear, capable of punching through the armor of a land raider. And the Telemann Heavy Dreadnought is a monster of a machine that rivals the Leviathan in size and power, its armor components rumored to have been personally forged by the Emperor himself. The Telemann's weaponry includes the Arachnus Storm Cannon, the Iliastus Culverin, and the Telemon Kestus, a power fist equipped with miniature plasma cannons. It even mounts a spiculous missile launcher and a refractor field generator, making it essentially a miniature Titan in all but name. Yet to be interred as a Custodes Dreadnought is a staggering commitment. The Custodes are individually crafted warriors, each one the product of years of effort and resources that dwarf what is required to create a Space Marine. To lose one is a blow that the Imperium can barely afford. To save one by interring them in a Dreadnought is a decision that carries enormous weight, and the Dreadnought chassis assigned to a fallen Custodes reflects the value the Imperium places on these extraordinary warriors. Each of these patterns and variants tells us something about the chapter that fields it and the Imperium that created it. The Castra Ferrum tells us about pragmatism and decline, the choice to use what can be maintained rather than what is best. The Contemptor tells us about a golden age of engineering that can never be reclaimed. What the Leviathan tells us about the Emperor's secrets and the terrible prices that power demands. The Redemptor tells us about a civilization that has forgotten how to value the individuals who serve it. The Furioso and the Death Company Dreadnought tell us about genetic curses that not even the tomb of the Dreadnought can escape. And the Custodes variants tell us about a standard of excellence that the rest of the Imperium can only dream of reaching. Together, they form a catalogue of the Imperium's virtues and its failures, its triumphs and its tragedies, its capacity for both engineering brilliance and callous indifference to the suffering of those who serve it. And each one, regardless of its pattern or its weapons or its chapter of origin, contains the same thing at its heart. A warrior who gave everything, and from whom more was still demanded. Let us now turn our attention to the individuals who have defined what it means to be a dreadnought. The legends, the heroes, the warriors whose names are spoken with reverence across the Imperium, not because of who they were in life, though that was impressive enough, but because of what they endured in death. The most famous dreadnought in the Imperium, the one whose name is known to virtually every space marine in every chapter, is Bjorn the Fell-Handed. Bjorn is a venerable dreadnought of the Space Wolves chapter, and he is, quite simply, the oldest living warrior in the Imperium of Man. He has been alive, in the loosest possible definition of that word, for more than 10,000 standard years. In his mortal life, before the wounds that would confine him to a dreadnaught's sarcophagus, he fought alongside the Emperor himself during the Great Crusade. He walked beside his Primarch, Leman Russ, across the battlefields of dozens of worlds. He witnessed the horror of the Horus Heresy firsthand, fighting in the burning of Prospero, where the Space Wolves destroyed the Thousand Suns Legion on the Emperor's orders, and in the desperate battles that followed. Bjorn's story before his interment is already the stuff of legend. During the burning of Prospero, he encountered a demon that had taken the form of Warmaster Horus, a being of terrible power that tried to destroy him by calling out his true name. The name magic failed because the daemon, working through a psychic link with the remembrancer Caspar Horza, only knew Bjorn by his low Gothic name, Bear, not his true Fenrisian name. But the demon's attack was not entirely unsuccessful. It sent a surge of warp energy through Bjorn's left arm, and the corruption began to spread. Either Horza or, according to some accounts, Constantin Valdor of the Custodes himself saved Bjorn's life by hacking off his arm at the elbow before the corruption could reach the rest of his body. This is one of the reasons he earned the title Fell-Handed, though he initially despised the name, insisting on calling himself Bjorn the One-Handed instead. After the Heresy, when Leman Russ gathered his personal retinue and departed for the Eye of Terror, never to return, Bjorn was the only member of the Wolf King's Guard who was left behind. The bitterness of that abandonment has never left him. Even 10,000 years later, Bjorn harbors intense feelings of rejection and resentment toward the Primarch he loved above all others, the father who left without explanation and apparently without thinking of those he was leaving behind. Some believe that Russ left Bjorn intentionally, knowing that the warrior's cold, stubborn anger would keep him alive and sane through the millennia of dreadnought internment, that Bjorn's fury at being abandoned would serve as an emotional anchor when everything else faded away. After Russ's disappearance, Bjorn assumed command of the Space Wolves, becoming the chapter's first Great Wolf. He led them with distinction until the Proxima Rebellion in 934 M31, when he was so severely wounded and crippled that he was beyond the aid of the chapter's apothecaries. His paralyzed body was transplanted into a dreadnought, and so began the longest vigil in Imperial history. For the next 500 years, Bjorn remained at the forefront of battle, his plasma cannon racking up a personal kill count said to be higher than that of some entire chapters. But eventually, the long years began to take their toll, and he started spending longer and longer periods dormant in stasis sleep. Today, Bjorn is awakened only rarely, once every century or so, to hold court at the Great Feast, where he recounts elements of his personal saga to the assembled Space Wolves. For the chapter, these occasions are sacred. Every Space Wolf present, from the Great Wolf himself to the youngest Bloodclaw, gathers in silent reverence to hear the eldest speak of their Primarch and the Age of Legends. For Bjorn, these awakenings are a tedious obligation. According to some accounts, he deliberately plays up his own confusion and senility, hoping that if the chapter thinks he is losing his grip on reality, they will eventually stop waking him up to tell the same stories over and over again. But do not mistake his irritability for weakness. Bjorn is still, even after 10,000 years, one of the most formidable warriors in the Imperium. His Dreadnought chassis, described as one of the most technologically advanced sarcophagi in existence, gives him faster movement, better reaction times, and more refined sensory input than most dreadnoughts can achieve. He fights on instinct, just as he always did when he was flesh and blood, and his massive lightning claw, True Claw, can peel apart enemy armor with terrifying ease. When the Space Wolves need their ancient guardian, shout when the threat is so severe that only the eldest will do, Bjorn answers the call with the same cold, furious determination that has sustained him across the millennia. If Bjorn represents the Dreadnought as enduring guardian, then Rylanor, the unyielding, represents the Dreadnought as eternal rebel. Rylanor was a hero of the Emperor's Children Legion during the Great Crusade, serving as the Legion's Ancient of Rites, the warrior responsible for overseeing the induction of new recruits and maintaining the Legion's ceremonial traditions. He was interred in a Contemptor-patterned dreadnought after being mortally wounded in battle against the Eldari several decades before the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, and he continued to serve in his ceremonial role from within his armored shell. Rylanor was said to possess an uncanny ability to perceive lies, a gift that would become bitterly relevant when his own Primarch, Fulgrim, led the Emperor's children into betrayal and corruption. When the War Master Horus unleashed his treachery at Istvan III, where loyal elements of the traitor legions were virus-bombed by their own brothers, Rylanor was among the loyalists targeted for death. He survived the initial betrayal and fought alongside the loyalist Emperor's children who refused to follow their Primarch into damnation. During the brutal fighting on Istvan III, Rylanor was reported destroyed multiple times, but each time, the ancient warrior endured. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Rylanor was buried in the rubble of Istvan III, trapped but alive, and his dreadnought systems keeping him conscious on the barren, dead world that the virus bombs had created, and there he stayed, for 10,000 years, alone on a lifeless planet, quarantined by the Imperium, forgotten by everyone who had once known him. Any lesser warrior would have gone mad in that isolation. Rylanor did go mad, to some degree, but his madness was not the aimless dissolution of a mind unmoored from reality. His madness had a purpose. His madness had a target. Rylanor spent 10 millennia constructing a trap. He built a psychic beacon designed to lure his former Primarch, the demon prince Fulgrim, back to Istvan III, and hidden within the beacon was an unexploded virus bomb, the same kind of weapon that had killed the planet in the first place. Rylanor's plan was simple in its terrible elegance. Bring Fulgrim to him. Detonate the bomb. Kill the monster who had betrayed everything the Emperor's children once stood for, or die trying. It was a suicide mission with a 10,000-year countdown. When Fulgrim finally came, drawn by the psychic signal, the demon Primarch was amused by the defiance of his former servant. He tore Rylanor's organic remains from the dreadnought shell, mocking the ancient warrior even as he destroyed him. But Rylanor had one last move. As Fulgrim held his broken body, Rylanor detonated the virus bomb. The explosion failed to kill the demon Primarch. Fulgrim's warp-blessed form was too powerful to be destroyed by such means, but it left a mark on the demon's soul that would never fully heal. And Rylanor, the Ancient of Rites who had waited 10,000 years for one moment of vengeance, was finally at rest. Rylanor's story is significant for several reasons. It demonstrates that a dreadnought pilot can retain not just consciousness but purpose across almost unimaginable spans of time, even without stasis, even without maintenance, even in total isolation. It suggests that the human will, or whatever remains of human will inside a dreadnought, is capable of feats that the machine's designers never imagined, and it provides a powerful counterpoint to the narrative of inevitable decline that dominates most dreadnought stories. Rylanor did not fade. He did not forget. He burned with a single, focused purpose for 10 millennia, and in the end, he achieved exactly what he set out to do. It was not a victory, exactly, but it was something. It was enough. The other end of the spectrum is represented by Murderfang, and we have already discussed his story in some detail. What makes Murderfang significant in the broader context of Dreadnought lore is that he represents the worst-case scenario, the absolute flaw of what can happen to a consciousness trapped inside one of these machines. He is a warning. This is where the path of the Dreadnought leads if you are unlucky enough, or if you are interred long enough, or if the particular quirks of your gene seed push you in the wrong direction. This is the final destination, a mind completely consumed, a warrior reduced to nothing but instinct and rage, a name lost forever. Between these extremes, the lore is filled with dreadnoughts whose stories illustrate different aspects of the experience. Davian Thule of the Blood Ravens was a chapter captain mortally wounded by Tyrannid bioweapons, as whose interment was documented in the Dawn of War video game series. The games showed the immediate aftermath of interment in poignant detail. Thule, freshly awakened in his new body, confused the faces around him, calling one Marine by the name of another who had died years before. The disorientation was palpable, the confusion heartbreaking, as this once sharp tactical mind struggled to reconcile the world it remembered with the filtered mechanical perception it now possessed. Malkarian of the Night Lords, a Chaos Dreadnought, described his existence as torture, waking only for battle and returning to cold, empty slumber. There was no triumph in his victories, no satisfaction in crushing the enemy, only duty, and not even duty in the noble sense, but the dull, mechanical compulsion of a weapon being pointed at a target and fired. But Carib Cullen of the Red Scorpions holds the distinction of being a chapter master who was interred in a Leviathan dreadnought after being critically wounded, becoming Carib Cullen the Risen. The decision to place the leader of an entire chapter inside the most mentally destructive dreadnought pattern in existence speaks volumes about how desperate his brothers were to preserve him, and about the terrible bargain they were willing to make. Each of these stories, and there are dozens more in the lore, adds another dimension to our understanding of what it means to become a dreadnought. They are not just war stories. They are stories about identity and loss, about duty and desperation, about the cost of survival in a universe that never stops demanding more from those who serve it. Now let us cross the line between loyalty and treachery and examine what happens to a dreadnought when it falls to the corrupting influence of the warp. Because if the fate of a loyal dreadnought is a tragedy, the fate of a chaos dreadnought is a horror beyond reckoning. When the Horus Heresy tore the Imperium apart, fully half of the Emperor's Space Marine legions betrayed their oaths and turned to the service of the Chaos Gods. Among the warriors who turned traitor were dreadnoughts, ancient heroes who had been interred in their mechanical shells before the corruption took hold, but who were swept along with their legions into damnation. For these warriors, the interment that had been presented as an honor was about to become something far, far worse. During the Heresy itself, when the traitor legions still had access to the full range of dreadnought patterns, including the Contemptor and the Leviathan. But even in those early days of corruption, the relationship between pilot and machine was beginning to change. The Wordbearers, the first legion to fall to chaos worship, produced the Mara-Gal-tainted Dreadnought, a variant whose occupant was a member of the Gal-Vorbak, warriors who had been possessed by demons and whose flesh had fused with their machine in ways that made the standard Dreadnought interment process look gentle by comparison. The Mara-Gal was half Contemptor, half demon engine, and wholly a weapon of terrifying power. It was also the beginning of a tradition among the Wordbearers of using Dreadnought interment as punishment rather than honor, forcing warriors who had displeased their commanders into sarcophagi where demons would be bound into their flesh. The World Eaters, driven to ever greater extremes of violence by the butcher's nails implanted in their brains at the command of their Primarch Angron, produced their own berserker dreadnoughts, machines animated by warriors who had been reduced to little more than rage incarnate. These were not tacticians or veterans preserved for their wisdom. These were killing machines in the most literal sense. Warriors so consumed by the desire for bloodshed that they would attack anything within reach, friend or foe, and had to be physically restrained when not in combat. But the true horror of the Chaos Dreadnought only became apparent in the millennia after the Heresy, when the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror and the technology to properly maintain their war machines began to decay. The Loyalist chapters, for all their struggles with technological decline, still had access to the Stasis vaults and maintenance rituals that helped preserve their dreadnoughts and slow the mental degradation of their pilots. The traitor legions had none of this. Without Stasis technology, the pilots of Chaos Dreadnoughts were left fully conscious inside their sarcophagi for centuries on end, with nothing to do but think and feel and slowly lose their minds. Without proper maintenance, the amniotic fluids that preserved the pilots degraded. The neural links that connected them to their machines corroded, and the life support systems that kept them alive began to malfunction in ways that caused constant, unrelenting pain. The result was madness. Not the gradual creeping confusion that affects loyalist dreadnoughts over millennia, but a fast, violent collapse into insanity. Chaos. Dreadnought pilots became screaming, raging lunatics, trapped inside walking weapons, their consciousness so shattered by pain and isolation that they could barely distinguish between ally and enemy. Many of them forgot who they were entirely, forgot why they were fighting, forgot everything except the need to destroy, to lash out, to make others suffer as they were suffering. For Chaos Space Marines, incarceration within a dreadnought is viewed not as an honor, but as a fate worse than death. And it is used accordingly, not as a reward for the most valued warriors, but as a punishment for those who have displeased their lords. Or the Hellbrute is the most common form of Chaos Dreadnought in the 41st millennium, and it represents the absolute nadir of what the Dreadnought concept can become. A Hellbrute is a dreadnought whose chassis has been hideously corrupted by the powers of the warp, its metal fusing with the flesh of the pilot inside until the entire machine appears to be made of something that is neither wholly organic nor wholly mechanical. The pilot's body melds with the hull, tentacles of mutated flesh growing into the machine's systems, faces and limbs pushing through the armor plating in grotesque displays of suffering. The pilot is no longer simply inside the Hellbrute. The pilot has become the Hellbrute, their flesh and the machine's metal becoming a single, agonized entity. The process of creating a Hellbrute is as horrifying as the result. Or unlike loyalist dreadnoughts, where the interment process, however traumatic, is at least conducted with some degree of medical care and ceremony, the creation of a Hellbrute is an act of deliberate cruelty. The wounded Chaos Marine is placed in an amniotic sarcophagus, yes, but the sarcophagus of a Hellbrute is a pseudo-parasitic device that actively causes the traumatizing transformation. Tentacles of unknown origin burrow into the victim's flesh and forcibly merge with their nervous system, a process that typically drives the pilot mad within hours, if not minutes. The few Hellbrutes that retain some shred of sanity inevitably welcome their own destruction, seeing death as the only escape from an existence that is nothing but pain. The Thousand Sons have their own particularly gruesome variation on this process. In the Thousand Sons Legion, Hellbrutes are created from those dreadnoughts that suffered the worst mutations on the planet of sorcerers. Their pilots transform through a series of rituals designed to bind their souls to the machine's systems. The legionary's body is flensed, reduced with warp flame to a burnt mass of organs, bones, and nerve fibers. This unfortunate creature, still conscious and fully aware of what is happening to them, is then placed in an amniotic sac and inserted into the Hellbrute. Between battles, the sac is removed and hung in special halls, surrounded by wards, where demons constantly try to reach the trapped soul. This only intensifies the madness and hatred of the legionary, making them a more destructive weapon with each deployment. Not all Chaos Dreadnoughts have degenerated into Hellbrutes, however. Yet the Ferrum Infernus designation is used for Chaos Dreadnoughts of the Castra Ferrum pattern that have somehow avoided mutation, their chassis remaining essentially the same as their Loyalist counterparts, despite millennia of exposure to the warp. These are relics of the Horus Heresy, irreplaceable since the knowledge to build new ones has been lost. The warriors interred within these machines vary widely in their mental state. Some have become experienced veterans, their tactical acumen sharpened by centuries of warfare. Others have descended into varying degrees of madness, their lucidity coming and going in waves. The Ferrum Infernus Dreadnoughts are respected among Chaos Space Marines, or at least feared, in a way that the howling, mindless Hellbrutes are not. The rarest and most prized of all Chaos Dreadnoughts is the Chaos Contemptor. Just as among the Loyalists, the Contemptor chassis is a relic of an age when the Imperium could build things it can no longer even understand. A Chaos Contemptor is typically reserved for the most powerful Chaos Lords, warriors of such status that they are granted the privilege of being interred in a chassis that will not drive them insane. Because of the Contemptor's superior design, including the systems that help protect the pilot's mental state, those interred within a Chaos Contemptor do not suffer the madness that plagues the occupants of lesser patterns. This makes the Chaos Contemptor uniquely dangerous, a weapon piloted by a veteran commander who retains their tactical intelligence, their cunning, and their capacity for strategic thought, combined with the raw power of one of the most formidable Dreadnought chassis ever built. Every Chaos Space Marine who expects to be seriously wounded in battle secretly hopes for a Contemptor. The reality, for the overwhelming majority, is something much worse. The Sonic Dreadnought is a variant specific to the Emperor's Children and other war bands dedicated to Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess and sensation. These machines are equipped with weapons that weaponize sound itself, unleashing devastating sonic attacks that can shatter bone and rupture organs. Only noise marines who are willing to give up all physical sensation upon interment can be trusted to pilot a sonic dreadnought without growing unstable, because the irony of serving Slaanesh from within a metal shell that can feel nothing at all is too much for most warriors to bear. The contrast between Loyalist and Chaos Dreadnoughts is one of the most effective pieces of world-building in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. On the Loyalist side, we have machines that are maintained with reverence and care, their pilots treated as honored elders whose wisdom is sought and whose service is valued. The process of interment is presented as an honor, even if the reality is considerably more ambiguous. On the Chaos side, we have machines that are barely maintained at all, their pilots treated as disposable weapons, or worse, as victims deserving of their punishment. The process of interment is openly acknowledged as a form of torture, a fate inflicted on the unwilling or the disobedient. And yet, stripped of the cultural trappings, the end result is remarkably similar. Both Loyalist and Chaos Dreadnought pilots are trapped in metal shells. Both lose their identities over time. Both are ultimately reduced from thinking, feeling beings to instruments of war. The difference is in the framing. The Imperium tells its dreadnoughts that they are honored. The Chaos Legions tell theirs that they are damned. But the experience itself, the isolation, the loss of self, the endless cycles of violence and oblivion, is much the same on both sides. This parallel is perhaps the most damning commentary the Dreadnought concept offers on the Imperium of man. When you strip away the ceremony and the rhetoric, when you look past the prayers and the anointing oils and the sacred vigils, what you find is a civilization that does to its greatest heroes essentially the same thing that the forces of chaos do to their worst enemies. The methods differ, the justifications differ, but the fundamental reality is the same. A living mind, trapped in a metal shell, slowly losing everything that made it who it was. That is the truth at the heart of the Dreadnought, and it is a truth that the Imperium can never afford to acknowledge. Let us sit with that thought for a moment before we continue, Because there is something important happening here that goes beyond the specifics of this particular piece of lore. The Dreadnought is not just a cool unit on the tabletop, or an interesting concept in a science fiction setting. It is a meditation on some of the deepest and most uncomfortable questions that human beings can ask. Questions about identity, about consciousness, about what makes us who we are, and what happens when those things are taken away one by one. Consider the paradox at the heart of the Dreadnought's existence. The whole purpose of the internment is to preserve the Marine, to save him from death so that his experience and wisdom can continue to serve the chapter. But the very process of preservation destroys the thing it is trying to save. The Marine's body is cut away. His senses are replaced by mechanical substitutes. His memories fade. His personality erodes. Over centuries, the living mind inside the sarcophagus becomes less and less distinguishable from the machine that surrounds it. At what point does the Marine cease to be the Marine and become simply the Dreadnought? At what point does the act of preservation become an act of destruction? At what point does the chapter stop saving a hero and start merely maintaining a weapon that happens to contain the echo of one? This is the Ship of Theseus problem writ in adamantium and ceramite. If you replace every part of a ship, is it still the same ship? If you strip away a warrior's body, replace his senses, erode his memories, and slowly dissolve his personality, is the consciousness that remains still the same warrior? Or is it something new, something that uses the warrior's name and carries fragments of his experience, but is, in any meaningful sense, a different entity? The lore does not give us a definitive answer to this question, and that ambiguity is part of what makes the Dreadnought concept so compelling. Different stories approach it differently. Some Dreadnought pilots seem to retain a strong sense of self even after millennia of interment, suggesting that identity can survive even the most extreme transformation. Others lose themselves entirely, becoming empty shells that respond to commands and process tactical data, but no longer possess anything recognizable as a personality. And many, perhaps most, fall somewhere in between, retaining enough of themselves to know what they have lost, which may be the cruelest fate of all. The question of agency is equally complex. Does a Dreadnought choose to fight, or is it simply responding to programming and conditioning? The answer, again, depends on the individual case. Bjorn clearly chooses to fight, his battles driven by anger and love, and a stubborn refusal to let the universe have the last word. R'hllor chose to fight so deliberately and so purposefully that he sustained a single-minded vendetta across 10,000 years of isolation. But what about the Dreadnought, who wakes up confused and disoriented, who cannot remember why he is fighting or who the enemy is, who attacks because his systems detect targets and his weapons respond to stimuli? Is that choice? Or is that the machine operating on autopilot while the last remnants of a human consciousness watch helplessly from within? And then there is the question of consent. No Marine chooses to become a Dreadnought. The decision is made for them while they lie broken and dying, unable to object even if they wanted to. The culture of the Space Marines, with its emphasis on duty, obedience, and the submission of individual desire to the needs of the chapter, ensures that even a Marine who dreads the prospect of interment will accept it without protest. This is presented by the Imperium as willing service, but how willing can service be when the alternative is death, and the culture provides no framework for refusal? This is not a question that the Imperium asks, of course. The Imperium does not ask uncomfortable questions. It operates on certainties, duty, service, sacrifice, honor, and any doubt is suppressed or reframed as weakness. But the Dreadnought's existence raises these questions, whether the Imperium wants to answer them or not. And the stories that are told about individual Dreadnoughts often engage with them in surprisingly nuanced ways. In the Black Library novel, The Glorious Tomb by Guy Haley, the experience of being a Dreadnought is explored from the inside, giving readers a first-hand look at the loneliness, the frustration, and the existential dread that comes with eternal service in a metal shell. The Night Lord's novel Soul Hunter by Aaron Dembski Bowden features Malkarian, a Chaos Dreadnought who reflects on his decaying body and the discomfort of existing in a mechanical form with unflinching honesty. These are not triumphant stories about glorious warriors continuing their service beyond death. They are stories about suffering, about loss, about the slow erosion of everything that makes a person a person. And they are all the more powerful for it. The Dreadnought story resonates beyond the borders of the Warhammer 40,000 setting because it touches on anxieties that are deeply relevant to our own world. The fear of losing our identities as we age, or the question of whether consciousness can survive the death of the body, the ethics of keeping someone alive against their will when their quality of life has deteriorated beyond a certain point, the way that institutions, whether they are military organizations or healthcare systems or governments, can reduce individuals to functions, valuing them for what they can do rather than who they are. The Dreadnought is science fiction, yes, but the questions it raises are as old as philosophy itself. There is also the question of the Dreadnought's role within the chapter, which mirrors in many ways the role of the elderly and the disabled within our own societies. Dreadnoughts are revered for their wisdom and their service, treated as sacred figures to be approached with respect and deference. But they are also kept separate from the rest of the chapter, stored in their own halls, awakened only when needed, their existence structured around the convenience of others rather than their own needs or desires. They are honored but isolated, respected but controlled, valued for what they represent rather than for what they experience. Sound familiar? The treatment of dreadnoughts by the chapter's tech marines is particularly telling. The tech marines approach the sleeping dreadnoughts with religious devotion, anointing their sarcophagi with sacred oils, murmuring prayers to the machine spirits within. But these rituals are not for the benefit of the pilot. They are for the benefit of the machine. The tech marines serve the Omnissiah, the machine god, and their devotion is directed at the dreadnought as a piece of technology, and not as a person. The pilot inside is, from the Mechanicus perspective, just another component, one that happens to be organic and somewhat fragile, but is ultimately subordinate to the machine it inhabits. This is the Imperium's fundamental attitude toward its citizens in microcosm. The individual exists to serve the state. The warrior exists to serve the chapter. The pilot exists to serve the dreadnought. At every level, the person is subordinated to the institution, their identity and their desires irrelevant in the face of duty and necessity. The dreadnought is the most extreme expression of this philosophy, but it is not an aberration. It is the logical endpoint of a culture that values service above all else, and has done so for 10,000 years. And yet, despite all of this, all of Crusade, despite the isolation and the loss and the slow dissolution of self, individual dreadnoughts continue to find moments of connection, moments of meaning, moments that suggest that the human spirit, however battered and diminished, is not entirely extinguished by the machine. Bjorn's grumpy affection for the space wolves who pester him for stories. Rilano's burning determination to avenge his fallen legion. The freshly interred dreadnought who recognizes something in the face of a young marine, some echo of a brother he once knew, and feels, however faintly, the warmth of connection. These moments are precious precisely because they are so rare and so fragile. They are the ember of humanity that survives even in the coldest, darkest tomb. Let us now come to the question that ties everything together. What is it about the dreadnought that has made it such an enduring and beloved part of the Warhammer 40,000 setting? Why has this concept, out of all the thousands of concepts that the setting contains, resonated so deeply with fans and become one of the most recognizable symbols of the franchise? The answer, I think, lies in the emotional complexity of the dreadnought's existence. In a setting that is often painted in broad strokes, good versus evil, order versus chaos, the Imperium versus everything else, the dreadnought introduces genuine moral ambiguity. Is interment an honor or a punishment? Is the dreadnought a hero or a prisoner? Is the Imperium saving its greatest warriors, or consuming them? The answer to all of these questions is yes and no simultaneously, and it is that ambiguity, yet that refusal to resolve into a simple narrative, that makes the Dreadnought so compelling. There is also something deeply appealing about the idea of the ancient warrior, the hero who has outlived everything he once knew, who carries the memory of a lost age, who walks among his successors as a living link to a past that would otherwise be forgotten. Every culture has this archetype, the old soldier, the wise elder, the ancestor who returns from beyond to guide the living. The Dreadnought is this archetype taken to its most extreme and most tragic expression. He is the old soldier who literally cannot rest, the wise elder who is slowly forgetting everything he once knew, the returning ancestor who no longer recognizes the world he has returned to. He is the mythological hero trapped in a story that has gone on far too long, and there is something both magnificent and heartbreaking about his refusal to stop. The visual design of the Dreadnought contributes enormously to its appeal. There is something inherently dramatic about a machine that walks like a person, but is clearly not a person, that carries weapons where arms should be, that has a face that is not a face, but a sarcophagus containing the remains of someone who once had one. The Dreadnought occupies an uncomfortable space between human and machine, familiar enough to be relatable, but alien enough to be unsettling. It is the uncanny valley made manifest in ceramite and adamantium, and that visual dissonance mirrors the conceptual dissonance of its existence. And the Dreadnought touches on something that is, at its core, a universal human fear, the fear of losing ourselves. Not death, or which is an ending, and therefore in some ways a mercy, but the slow, gradual erosion of who we are, the forgetting, the fading, the moment when you look in the mirror, metaphorically speaking, and do not recognize the person looking back. We all fear this. We all know people who have experienced it. The Dreadnought takes this fear and magnifies it to cosmic proportions, stretching it across millennia, wrapping it in adamantium, and sending it to war. And in doing so, it transforms a deeply personal anxiety into something epic, something that can be explored and examined, and maybe, in some small way, understood. The Dreadnought also serves as a powerful narrative device within the broader setting. Because a Dreadnought can be thousands of years old, it can serve as a connection between different eras of the timeline, as a living witness to events that happened millennia ago. When a novelist or a codex writer wants to bring the distant past into the present, to give a contemporary character access to historical knowledge that would otherwise be lost, the Dreadnought provides a perfect vehicle. Bjorn can speak of Lehman Russ because he was there. A venerable Dreadnought can describe the founding of his chapter because he fought in it. The Dreadnought is a walking archive, a living history book, and in a setting where so much has been lost and forgotten, that makes it invaluable. But I think the deepest reason for the Dreadnought's resonance is something simpler and more fundamental than any of this. The Dreadnought is a story about continuing, about not giving up, and about finding meaning in existence even when that existence has been reduced to its most minimal form. The pilot inside the sarcophagus has lost almost everything: his body, his senses, his memories, his identity. And yet, he keeps going. He wakes when called. He fights when needed. He offers what he can. He endures. In a universe defined by despair, where the tagline is literally, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war," the Dreadnought's stubborn refusal to stop is itself a kind of hope. Not the bright, shining hope of victory or redemption, but the quiet, grim, teeth-clenched hope of endurance. The hope that says, "I am still here. I am still fighting. I have not forgotten everything. Not yet." That is a hope that resonates with anyone who has ever struggled to keep going in the face of overwhelming odds, who has ever felt like they were losing pieces of themselves but refused to give up. And in the end, that is what the Dreadnought is really about. Not the weapons, not the armor, not the walking tomb. The Dreadnought is about the human spirit, battered and diminished, but still burning, still refusing to go out, even in the coldest and darkest night. Let us take this idea and follow it to its logical conclusion, because the Dreadnought's place in the broader thematic architecture of Warhammer 40,000 is more nuanced than it might first appear. The Imperium of man is, by design, a deeply flawed civilization. It is a fascist theocracy, a totalitarian nightmare state that has strip-mined the galaxy for 10,000 years to feed its endless wars. It treats its citizens as expendable resources, its soldiers as instruments of state violence, was its heroes as propaganda tools. Every noble ideal that it claims to uphold, honor, duty, sacrifice, faith, is twisted by the machinery of empire into something that serves the institution rather than the individual. The Dreadnought exists within this context, and it both reflects and challenges the Imperium's values. On one hand, the Dreadnought is the Imperium's ideology taken to its logical extreme. The individual exists to serve. The body belongs to the Emperor. Duty does not end with death. The Dreadnought is the ultimate expression of the Imperium's demand for total, unconditional, eternal service, a warrior who cannot retire, cannot resign, cannot die, cannot stop. He serves because service is all there is, all there has ever been, all there ever will be. He is the Imperium's vision of the perfect soldier, and the horror of his existence is the horror of that vision made real. On the other hand, the individual dreadnoughts who populate the lore repeatedly demonstrate qualities that the Imperium's ideology has no room for. Bjorn's bitterness and sarcasm, Rylanor's individual vendetta, the freshly interred pilot's grief for the life he has lost. These are not the reactions of a perfectly obedient instrument of state. These are the reactions of a person who is trapped and suffering and trying to make sense of an existence that the propaganda has told them is glorious, but that feels like anything but. The Dreadnought's humanity, his persistent, stubborn, unkillable humanity, is itself a form of resistance against the system that created him. He was supposed to become a weapon. He keeps being a person, and that is, in its own quiet way, a kind of rebellion. This tension between the system and the individual is what gives the Dreadnought its emotional weight. The system says this is an honor. The individual feels it as a curse. The system says he should be grateful. He feels grief. The system says his service continues. He feels trapped. And the system cannot hear any of this because the system is not designed to listen to individuals. It is designed to use them. And so the Dreadnought's suffering goes unacknowledged. His humanity goes unrecognized. And the machine keeps marching, carrying a wounded soul that no one bothers to ask about because, in the Imperium of man, the soul of a soldier is not the Imperium's concern. If that is not the most grim-dark thing in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting, I do not know what is. There is one more aspect of the Dreadnought that deserves our attention before we bring this journey to a close, and that is the question of how Dreadnoughts relate to the broader technology and culture of the Imperium. The Dreadnought is, fundamentally, a product of technological decline. The greatest patterns, the Contemptor, the Leviathan, the Deredeo, were designed and built during an era when the Imperium, or rather the pre-imperial civilization that preceded it, possessed knowledge and manufacturing capabilities that have been irretrievably lost. The Castroferum pattern, the standard of the 41st millennium, is explicitly described as a compromise, a design that was chosen not because it was the best, but because it was the simplest to maintain. The Redemptor, the newest pattern, was designed by a man, Belisarius Cawl, who spent 10,000 years working on it, and still could not match the elegance and the pilot-friendly design of the Contemptor. This pattern of decline is central to the Imperium's identity. The Imperium is a civilization that is worse in almost every measurable way than the civilization that preceded it. Its technology is inferior. Its governance is inferior. Its understanding of the universe is inferior. Its treatment of its citizens is inferior. The Imperium endures not because it is good or just or wise, but because it is vast and violent and too stubbornly entrenched to be easily destroyed. and the Dreadnought embodies this decline perfectly. Once, the Imperium could build machines that protected their pilots' sanity and could last for millennia without significant degradation. Now, and it builds machines that burn their pilots out in decades and treat the resulting corpse as a recyclable component. Once, the interment of a hero was accompanied by genuinely advanced medical care and sophisticated cybernetic integration. Now, it is a brutal process carried out with half-understood rituals and prayer. The Mechanicum's role in this is particularly significant. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of Mars, are the Imperium's keepers of technological knowledge. They are also, fundamentally, a religious institution, a cult that worships the machine god and treats technology not as a tool to be understood and improved, but as a sacred mystery to be preserved and venerated. The Mechanicum does not innovate. It maintains, it replicates, it performs the same rituals over and over, hoping that correct observance will produce correct results, without any understanding of the underlying principles. This is why the Imperium cannot build new contemptors. The knowledge of how to do so was lost, and the Mechanicum's approach to technology, which prioritizes rote replication over genuine understanding, provides no mechanism for recovering what has been forgotten. The Dreadnought is a perfect symbol of this dysfunctional relationship between the Imperium and its own technology. The tech marines who maintain the Dreadnoughts treat them with religious reverence, anointing them with oils and murmuring prayers, but they do not truly understand how they work. If a critical component fails, they may be able to replace it from their dwindling stockpiles of ancient parts, or they may cannibalize another Dreadnought chassis for spares. But they cannot manufacture a new component from scratch. They cannot improve the design. They cannot fix the fundamental problems that cause pilots to lose their minds over time. They can only maintain and hope and pray. This is the Imperium in a single image, a civilization that maintains what it cannot understand, that prays over machines it cannot fix, that sends its greatest heroes into battle inside relics it cannot replace, and that calls this arrangement glory, because the alternative, acknowledging the depths of its own decay, is too terrible to contemplate. The Redemptor Dreadnought throws this into even sharper relief. Here is a machine that was explicitly designed by Call's subordinates with, and again this bears repeating, was little thought to the health of the incumbent. This is not just technological decline. This is a conscious choice. The tech priests who built the Redemptor had the option of designing a machine that was gentler on its pilot. They chose not to. They chose performance over preservation, power over people. And the Imperium accepted this choice without protest, because the Imperium has been making that same choice for 10,000 years, choosing the institution over the individual, choosing the war machine over the warrior, choosing the mission over the man. And so the Dreadnoughts march on, across 1,000,000 battlefields, on 1,000 worlds. The walking tombs of the Imperium's greatest heroes continue their eternal service. Some are ancient beyond measure, their pilots' minds reduced to flickering embers of consciousness in shells of adamantium. Some are freshly interred, their pilots still sharp and aware, still remembering what it felt like to breathe real air and see through their own eyes. Some have crossed the line into madness, their screams echoing through their hulls as they charge mindlessly into the enemy. Some have found a kind of peace, an acceptance of their fate that allows them to function with dignity and purpose, even as the centuries strip away everything they once were. All of them are weapons. All of them are prisons. All of them are monuments to the cost of eternal war. And all of them, in their own way, are reminders of something that the Imperium of man desperately needs to remember but has long since forgotten. That the warriors who serve it are not just resources to be managed, not just components to be installed, not just names on scrolls to be read at ceremonies and forgotten. They are people. They were people. And the fact that they continue to fight, continue to endure, continue to care even when the machine has consumed almost everything else, is not a testament to the Imperium's glory. It is a testament to the indestructibility of the human spirit, the one thing that even the walking tomb of a dreadnought cannot fully contain. Before we close this evening, I want to spend just a few more moments on the subject, because there are aspects of the dreadnought experience that we have not yet fully explored, and they deserve their place in this accounting. The awakening of a dreadnought is always an event of significance within a chapter, but the rituals vary from chapter to chapter, reflecting the unique culture and traditions of each, but certain elements are common to most. The tech marine who oversees the activation will have spent days preparing the sarcophagus, checking the systems, performing the sacred rites of activation that the Mechanicum prescribes. A chaplain will be present, ready to speak the words of greeting that tradition demands, to ground the awakening pilot in the present, and help them orient themselves after what may have been decades or centuries of stasis. The first moments after awakening are always the hardest. The pilot's consciousness surfaces slowly, like a diver rising from deep water. There is confusion, always confusion, a desperate groping for the familiar that finds only the strange. As the pilot reaches for hands that are no longer there and finds weapons. He tries to speak and hears a voice that is not his own. He searches for the faces of brothers he remembers and finds strangers wearing the heraldry of a chapter that has changed in his absence in ways he cannot immediately comprehend. For the brothers who witness the awakening, it is an experience that straddles the line between awe and discomfort. They are standing in the presence of a living relic, a warrior who may have fought in battles that are now legend, whose experience and wisdom dwarf anything they could hope to achieve in their own lifetimes. But they are also standing next to a being that is clearly not fully present, a consciousness struggling to reconcile its memories with its reality, a voice that is eerily, not quite human, emanating from a machine that is taller than any of them and bristling with weapons that could kill them all in an instant. The relationship between a dreadnought and the chapter's living marines is complex and constantly negotiated. Dreadnoughts are officially the most revered members of the chapter, second only to the chapter master himself, and in some cases exceeding even that authority. A venerable dreadnoughts council is sought on matters of strategy and tradition, and younger marines are expected to approach the ancients with the same respect they would show a shrine. But there is also an unspoken distance. The dreadnought is not part of the chapter's daily life. He does not eat with his brothers, does not train with them, does not share their barracks or their camaraderie. He sleeps in his own hall, surrounded by other sleeping machines, tended by tech marines rather than by fellow warriors. He is revered but separate, honored but alone. Some marines find creative ways to bridge this gap. In the Space Wolves, the tradition of the Great Feast, where Bjorn recounts his saga to the assembled chapter, serves this purpose, creating a regular, ritualized moment of connection between the ancient and the living. In other chapters, particularly those with strong traditions of ancestor worship, the awakened dreadnoughts are treated as quasi-religious figures, their words taken as scripture, and their presence on the battlefield treated as a sign of the Emperor's favor. But in all cases, the relationship is shaped by the fundamental asymmetry of the dreadnought's existence. He remembers them. They age and die while he sleeps. When he wakes, they are gone, replaced by new faces that he does not recognize and will not remember. The experience of combat from inside a dreadnought is, according to the lore, both exhilarating and disturbing. The dreadnought's weapons respond to the pilot's will as naturally as a living warrior's arms respond to their brain. Aiming and firing an assault cannon or a multi-melter feels as instinctive as breathing once did, each round a thought made manifest. The dreadnought's strength, far beyond anything the pilot possessed in life, makes close combat almost surreal. Power fists that can crush ceramite like tinfoil. A body that can shrug off weapons fire that would have killed the pilot a dozen times over in his mortal form. There is a grim satisfaction in this power, a sense of invulnerability that, almost for a brief time, makes the isolation and the loss seem almost worthwhile. But the satisfaction is fleeting, and for many pilots, it fades faster with each awakening. The initial thrill of combat gives way to routine. Routine gives way to numbness, and numbness gives way to something approaching despair. The pilot realizes that he is not fighting for victory or honor or the Emperor. He is fighting because fighting is all he has left. It is the only time his existence has purpose, the only time anyone needs him, the only time the universe acknowledges that he is still, in some diminished sense, alive. And when the fighting stops, when the enemy is defeated and the transport arrives to carry him back to his tomb, the purpose drains away and there is nothing left but the void. There is a passage in the lore that describes how a dreadnought is transported after a battle. He is loaded into a separate compartment, secured against movement, his systems gradually cycling down to standby mode. His brothers board the transport separately, their voices raised in songs of triumph that the dreadnought can hear through his audio sensors but cannot join. A young marine might say, "Sleep well, Ancient One," meaning it kindly, not understanding that sleep is not rest for a dreadnought, but a kind of death. And as the dreadnought's consciousness fades, he wonders when he will wake again, and what he will wake to find. This cycle of awakening, fighting, and returning to sleep is the heartbeat of a dreadnought's existence, and it is a heartbeat that slows over time. As the centuries pass, and the pilot's mind deteriorates, the periods of stasis grow longer, and the periods of wakefulness grow shorter. A dreadnought that was once awakened every few years might eventually be awakened only once a century. A dreadnought that was once deployed for weeks at a time might eventually be fielded for only a single battle before being returned to stasis. The chapter is not being cruel. They are being practical. Extended wakefulness accelerates the mental degradation, and the longer a dreadnought is kept active, the more confused and disoriented it becomes. Stasis slows the decay, or at least that is the theory. In practice, even stasis cannot stop it entirely. Each cycle takes its toll, and the toll accumulates, and eventually there comes a day when the dreadnought wakes and no longer knows who or what it is. When that day comes, when the last spark of consciousness finally gutters out, the chapter treats the event with solemn ceremony. The silent dreadnought is brought to the chapter's halls of remembrance, its weapons deactivated, its systems powered down for the last time. The chapter master delivers a eulogy, speaking of duty fulfilled and sacrifice honored. The assembled Marines listen with the reverence appropriate to such occasions. And then the dreadnought is placed in its final resting place, its sarcophagus sealed, its name added to the rolls of the chapter's honored dead. After centuries or millennia of service, the ancient is finally granted the rest that was so long denied. The empty chassis may be given to another fallen hero. If the chapter has need and the sarcophagus is compatible, the cycle will begin again. A new name on the scroll, a new consciousness in the machine, a new soul beginning the long, slow journey from person to weapon to memory to silence. And so the wheel turns, as it has turned for 10,000 years, as it will turn for 10,000 more, or until the last dreadnought falls, and the last chapter scatters, and the last echo of the Imperium fades from the galaxy forever. But we are not there yet. The dreadnoughts still march, the ancients still wake, the war still calls, and they still answer. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that is what passes for hope. But before we get to that closing, I realize there is so much more that we should explore together. Because the dreadnought is not just a single concept, it is an entire ecosystem of ritual, technology, belief, and suffering that permeates every level of a Space Marine chapter. And if we are going to do this subject justice, truly do it justice, we need to go deeper. We need to talk about the details that the surface level lore only hints at. The things that happen in the shadows of the fortress monastery, in the hours before a dreadnought walks to war, in the long silences between the bursts of violence that punctuate its existence. Let us start with something that is often overlooked in discussions of dreadnoughts, but that is absolutely central to their existence. The Stasis Vault. Deep beneath the fortress monastery of every Space Marine chapter, past the armories and the training halls and the sanctuaries of the chaplains, past even the gene seed vaults and the sacred reliquaries, there exist chambers that are among the most heavily protected spaces in the entire fortress. These are the halls of the ancients, the stasis vaults where the chapter's dreadnoughts sleep between wars. They are vast, echoing spaces, designed not for comfort, but for preservation. The air is cool and dry, maintained at precise levels of temperature and humidity to minimize corrosion of the dreadnought chassis. The lighting is dim, kept low to reduce energy consumption and to create an atmosphere of reverence appropriate to the nature of the occupants. Row upon row of sarcophagi line the walls, some humming with the quiet power of active life support systems, their occupants lost in the dreamless void of stasis. Others sit cold and silent, their ancient inhabitants finally granted the peace of true rest, or their chassis awaiting a new pilot who has not yet fallen. The atmosphere in these halls is one of profound solemnity. Living Marines who enter them do so with the same hushed respect they would bring to a cathedral or a mausoleum. Some chapters have specific rituals associated with visiting the stasis vaults. The Ultramarines, for instance, maintain a tradition where newly promoted sergeants are brought to the halls of the ancients before their first deployment in their new rank, to stand before the sleeping dreadnoughts and reflect on the sacrifices of those who came before them. The Black Templars, with their characteristic fervor, treat the stasis vaults as sites of active pilgrimage, where initiates can pray for the strength to match the heroes who sleep within. The Imperial Fists have been known to station honor guards at the entrance to their dreadnought halls, in a tradition that dates back to the days of the Horus Heresy and that has been maintained without interruption for 10 millennia. The Tech Marines who are responsible for maintaining the dreadnoughts in their care approach their duties with a blend of technical precision and religious devotion that is characteristic of their dual allegiance to both their chapter and the Mechanicum. Each day, or at least each time the chapter's schedule allows, the Tech Marines visit the stasis vaults to perform their rites of maintenance. They check the power levels of each sarcophagus, ensuring that the life support systems are functioning within acceptable parameters. They examine the amniotic fluid that sustains the pilot, testing its chemical composition and replacing it if necessary. They inspect the neural interfaces, looking for signs of degradation or malfunction, and they perform the spiritual rituals that the Mechanicum prescribes, anointing the dreadnought's hull with sacred unguents, murmuring prayers to the machine spirit that the tech priests believe inhabits every piece of sophisticated technology. The concept of the machine spirit is worth pausing on, because it adds another layer of complexity to the dreadnought's existence. According to the beliefs of the Adeptus Mechanicus, every sufficiently complex machine possesses a spirit, a semi-sentient awareness that must be placated, honored, and cooperated with if the machine is to function properly. For simple devices, this spirit is little more than a tendency toward reliability or temperamentality, the reason why one bolter jams more often than another, or why one vehicle seems to handle better than its identical counterparts. But for a machine as complex as a dreadnought, the machine spirit is believed to be something much more significant, an entity in its own right, capable of influencing the dreadnought's behavior in subtle but real ways. This raises fascinating questions about the relationship between the pilot and the machine. Is the dreadnought's personality entirely the product of its pilot's consciousness, or is it a blend of the pilot and the machine spirit, two separate entities sharing a single body? The lore suggests that the truth is somewhere in between. Some dreadnoughts exhibit behaviors that seem to come from the machine, rather than the pilot, and tendencies toward particular combat styles or weapon preferences that do not match the pilot's known personality. Others seem to develop quirks over time that cannot be attributed to either the pilot or the machine alone, but appear to emerge from the interaction between the two. The machine translates the pilot's thoughts into actions, but the translation is never perfect. And in the gaps between intention and execution, something new sometimes emerges. The Leviathan Dreadnought is the most extreme example of this phenomenon. The lore describes its pilots as being trapped in dreams of the Horus Heresy that haunt the machines themselves, suggesting that the Leviathan chassis carries some kind of residual awareness, a memory, or an echo of past conflicts that bleeds into the consciousness of whoever is installed within. This is not simply mechanical malfunction. This is the machine itself influencing the mind of its pilot, overwriting the warrior's own experiences with images and sensations from a war that happened 10,000 years ago. The machine spirit of the Leviathan is not a passive presence. It is an active force, and it is not entirely benign. For the tech priests, all of this is filtered through the lens of their religious beliefs. The machine spirit is a manifestation of the Omnissiah, the machine god, and its quirks and demands are expressions of divine will, rather than engineering failures. When a dreadnought behaves erratically, the tech priest does not diagnose a malfunction. He identifies a spiritual imbalance and performs the appropriate rituals to restore harmony between the pilot and the machine spirit. When a pilot's consciousness finally fades, the tech priest does not record a biological failure. He notes that the pilot's organic spirit has rejoined the Omnissiah, leaving the machine spirit in sole possession of the chassis until a new pilot is installed. This religious framework, however bizarre it might seem from an outside perspective, serves a practical purpose within the chapter. It provides a language for discussing the complex and often disturbing phenomena associated with dreadnought interment, without having to confront the full horror of what is actually happening. When a tech marine says that the machine spirit is restless, what he means, whether he knows it or not, is that the pilot's consciousness is deteriorating in unpredictable ways. When he says that the machine spirit and the pilot are in harmony, what he means is that the pilot's mental state is currently stable. The religious language creates a buffer between the reality of the dreadnought's suffering and the people who are responsible for maintaining it, allowing them to do their jobs without being overwhelmed by the moral implications of what they are doing. But there are moments when the buffer breaks down, moments when the reality of the dreadnought's existence pushes through the religious language and confronts the chapter with truths that its traditions are not equipped to handle. When a pilot wakes up screaming, unable to remember where or who he is, and the tech marines have to sedate him before he damages his own sarcophagus in his confusion. When a venerable dreadnought, awakened for the 1000th time, speaks to the chapter master in a voice heavy with exhaustion and asks, very quietly, how much longer his service will be required, and the chapter master has to answer, as long as the emperor wills it, because there is no other answer available. When a chaplain performs the rites of awakening and realizes, with a cold shock, that the consciousness behind the dreadnought's optical senses is no longer the warrior he remembers, but something else entirely, something that wears the warrior's name but does not recognize it. These moments are the cracks in the armor, not the physical armor of the dreadnought, which is nearly impervious, but the psychological armor of the institution that maintains it. The chapter needs to believe that dreadnought interment is an honor, because the alternative is to admit that it is a form of cruel captivity. And that admission would undermine the foundations of the chapter's entire culture of sacrifice and duty. So the cracks are sealed, the uncomfortable questions are suppressed, the rituals continue, the prayers continue, the anointing continues, and the dreadnoughts sleep and wake and fight and sleep again, and the wheel turns. Let us talk now about deployment, about what happens when the order comes down from the chapter master and the ancient must be roused from his slumber to walk to war once more. The activation of a dreadnought is a process that combines technical precision with religious ceremony, and it typically takes several hours from the initial order to the moment when the dreadnought's systems are fully operational and the pilot's consciousness has stabilized enough for combat deployment. The tech marines begin by disengaging the stasis field that has kept the dreadnought in suspended animation. This is not simply a matter of flipping a switch. The stasis field must be reduced gradually, allowing the pilot's biological functions to resume at a controlled pace. Too fast, and the shock can cause neural damage. Too slow, and the pilot's consciousness may surface in a confused, agitated state that can take hours to resolve. As the stasis field recedes, the Dreadnought's internal systems begin to come online one by one. Power cells charge. Life support systems engage. The amniotic fluid that has been maintained at preservation temperature begins to warm, bringing circulation back to the pilot's remaining organs. Neural interfaces are tested, each connection checked and verified before the pilot's consciousness is allowed to access the Dreadnought's motor systems. During this process, the Techmarine monitors a bank of diagnostic instruments, watching for anomalies that might indicate a problem with the pilot's mental state or the machine's systems. While the Techmarines work, the chaplain prepares the spiritual aspects of the awakening. In many chapters, this involves reading from the chapter's sacred texts, reciting the deeds of the warrior who sleeps within, and invoking the blessings of the Emperor and the Primarch upon the coming battle. The chaplain's role is not just ceremonial. His voice, projected through the Dreadnought's internal speakers, is often the first thing the pilot hears as consciousness returns. A familiar cadence, a recognizable pattern of words, can help ground the pilot in reality and reduce the disorientation that always accompanies awakening. The best chaplains develop a personal rapport with their chapter's Dreadnoughts, learning the particular words and phrases that resonate with each individual pilot, the names that still evoke recognition, the battle cries that can cut through the fog of confusion and reach the warrior within. The moment of full awakening is always tense. The pilot's optical sensors engage, flooding his consciousness with visual data after what may have been decades of total darkness. His audio pickups activate, filling his awareness with sounds that may be familiar or utterly foreign, depending on how much has changed during his absence. His motor systems come online, and for the first time in years or centuries, he can move, while reaching out with hands that are power fists, taking steps that shake the ground, turning a head that is an armored turret. The chaplain speaks the words of greeting. The Techmarine confirms that all systems are nominal, and the Ancient, for better or worse, is back. What happens next depends on the urgency of the situation. If time permits, the newly awakened Dreadnought will be given a period to acclimate, to receive briefings on the current state of the chapter and the galaxy, to learn the names and faces of the Marines who will fight alongside him. Some chapters assign a specific Marine, called a herald or a keeper, depending on the tradition, to serve as the Dreadnought's liaison with the living, translating between the Ancient's fragmentary understanding and the present reality, filling in the gaps that Stasis has created. And this Marine becomes the Dreadnought's link to the world outside his metal shell, the one person who knows both what the Ancient remembers and what he has forgotten. If time does not permit, and in the 41st Millennium it often does not, the Dreadnought is briefed quickly and deployed immediately. The pilot is given coordinates, objectives, threat assessments, the bare minimum of information needed to fight effectively. The rest, the context, the significance, the strategic picture, is left for later, if later comes. A Dreadnought deployed in this manner fights on instinct and training, rather than on comprehensive understanding, and the results can be both devastating and tactically unpredictable. A Dreadnought who does not fully understand why he is fighting can be even more destructive than one who does, because he has no reason to hold back, no concern for the broader strategic implications of his actions. He simply destroys what is in front of him, because destroying is what he was built to do. The deployment of a Dreadnought on the battlefield has an effect on the Marines around him that goes beyond his considerable firepower. The mere presence of an Ancient on the field is a powerful morale boost for the living Marines. They are fighting alongside a hero of their chapter, a warrior who may have been present at the founding, who may have fought beside Primarchs and Saints, whose very existence is proof that the chapter's traditions and its fighting spirit have endured across the millennia. When a Dreadnought advances, his heavy footsteps shaking the earth, his weapons blazing, Yet his mechanical voice booming commands and battle cries across the Voxnet, the Marines around him feel a surge of pride and determination that transcends ordinary military discipline. They are not just fighting for the Emperor, they are fighting alongside a living legend. The psychological effect on the enemy is equally significant, though in the opposite direction. A dreadnought is a terrifying sight on the battlefield, a towering wall of adamantium and ceramite, bristling with weapons, advancing with a steady, relentless pace that no amount of small arms fire can slow. The ground shakes with each step. The air fills with the roar of its weapons. And somewhere inside that massive, impervious hull, a consciousness is watching, choosing targets, calculating angles of fire, directing the machine's terrible strength with a precision that no automated system could match. For the enemies of the Imperium, facing a dreadnought is not just a tactical challenge. It is a confrontation with something that seems, and in a very real sense is, unstoppable. You cannot reason with it. You cannot frighten it. You cannot outrun it. You can only try to stop it. And stopping a dreadnought requires the kind of concentrated anti-armor firepower that most infantry formations simply do not possess. There is a detail in the lore that I find particularly evocative. When a dreadnought falls in battle, when the sarcophagus is breached and the pilot's organic remains are destroyed, the chapter will fight to recover the chassis. Not just for practical reasons, though the irreplaceable nature of the dreadnought chassis certainly motivates this. They fight to recover the body because the dreadnought is, in the chapter's eyes, a fallen brother, a hero who deserves the rights of the dead and a place in the chapter's mausoleum. The same chapter that was relying on the dreadnought's firepower to break through the enemy line will now throw additional lives into danger to retrieve the empty shell, because the shell is sacred, because the hero within it deserves to rest in hallowed ground. Let us talk about the dreadnoughts of different chapters in more detail, because the way a chapter treats its ancients tells us a great deal about the chapter's character and its values. The Ultramarines, as one might expect from the most codex-compliant of all chapters, approach dreadnought management with methodical precision. Their ancients are maintained according to strict protocols inherited from the teachings of their Primarch, Robut Guilliman. Awakening schedules are carefully planned. Deployment is governed by tactical doctrine. The Dreadnought's council is sought formally, through structured meetings with the chapter's leadership, rather than through the informal, almost familial interactions that characterize some other chapters. The Ultramarines' dreadnoughts are respected and well maintained, but the relationship between the living and the entombed is defined by procedure rather than by personal connection. This is both a strength and a limitation. It ensures consistency and reliability, but it can also make the dreadnought feel like a managed asset rather than a valued comrade. The Salamanders, by contrast, treat their dreadnoughts with a warmth and personal affection that reflects the chapter's broader emphasis on human connection and compassion. Salamanders' dreadnoughts are spoken to as brothers, not as relics. Their preferences are noted and accommodated where possible. Their awakening rituals include personal touches, familiar scents, and sounds from the chapter's homeworld of Nocturne, designed to ease the transition back to consciousness. The Salamander's most famous dreadnought, Sokar Braearth Ashmantle, is housed in a unique ironclad chassis called the Iron Dragon, which incorporates a one-of-a-kind enhanced reactor system and uncommonly heavy armor. The chapter treats him not as a weapon to be maintained, but as a brother to be cared for, and this attitude extends to all of their ancients. The Dark Angels maintain a characteristically secretive approach to their dreadnoughts. The chapter's obsessive concern with its own hidden history, with the betrayal of their fallen brothers during the Horus Heresy, and the ongoing hunt for the traitor members of their legion, shapes every aspect of their culture, including how they interact with their ancients. Dark Angels dreadnoughts who predate the betrayal are considered potential sources of dangerous knowledge, living witnesses to events that the chapter's leadership would prefer to keep hidden, even from its own members. These dreadnoughts are carefully monitored, their utterances during episodes of confusion or delirium, noted and recorded by the chapter's inner circle. It is not entirely clear whether this monitoring is motivated by a desire to protect the chapter's secrets, or by a desire to learn more about them, and the ambiguity is very much in keeping with the Dark Angel's character. The Iron Hands, a chapter that venerates the machine and seeks to replace their own flesh with cybernetics whenever possible, might be expected to view Dreadnought Internment with something approaching enthusiasm. After all, the Dreadnought represents the ultimate fusion of man and machine, the final step in the replacement of weak flesh with strong iron. And to some extent, this is true. The Iron Hands view their Dreadnoughts with a respect that borders on envy, seeing them as warriors who have achieved what every Iron Hand aspires to, the transcendence of biological limitation. But there is also a darker undercurrent. As the Iron Hands lost the majority of their Dreadnoughts during the drop site massacre at the beginning of the Horus Heresy, and the chapter has never been able to fully replace those losses. The relative scarcity of Dreadnoughts within the Iron Hands serves as a constant reminder of the catastrophe that shaped the chapter's identity, and the reverence they show their remaining ancients is tinged with the grief of knowing how many were lost. The Space Wolves' approach to their Dreadnoughts is, predictably, the most colourful and the most personal. The Wolves do not stand on ceremony. They treat their ancients as respected elders within a tribal structure, seeking their counsel with a directness that would seem almost disrespectful in more formal chapters, but that is perfectly natural within the Wolves' culture of warrior fellowship. Bjorn's annual awakenings at the Great Feast are raucous affairs, with the assembled chapter drinking and telling stories, and generally carrying on in a manner that would give an ultramarine chaplain an aneurysm. But beneath the boisterousness is a genuine affection for the old warrior, a recognition that he is not just a relic to be maintained, but a father figure to be loved and listened to, even when his patience with the younger generation's questions has worn thin. The Blood Angels, as we have discussed, have the additional complication of the Black Rage hanging over their Dreadnoughts like a sword of Damocles. Every Blood Angel's Dreadnought is monitored for signs of the Rage, and every awakening carries with it the possibility that the pilot will succumb and have to be inducted into the Death Company. The chapter's sanguinary priests, the equivalent of apothecaries in other chapters, work closely with the Tech Marines to manage this risk, using specialized chemical compounds and psychic techniques to stabilize the pilot's mental state. But they can never eliminate the risk entirely. The Black Rage is a product of the gene seed itself, woven into the very DNA of every Blood Angel, and no amount of medical intervention can fully suppress it. A Blood Angel's Dreadnought might serve for centuries without incident and then, upon one particular awakening, feel the rage descend upon him like a black tide, drowning the last vestiges of his personality in an ocean of inherited grief and fury. Let us also consider what happens between battles, during the brief periods when a Dreadnought is awake but not deployed. As these interludes are rare and precious, and different Dreadnoughts use them in different ways. Some seek out the company of the living, engaging in conversations that help them maintain their connection to the present. Others prefer solitude, retreating to quiet corners of the fortress monastery to process their fragmented memories and try to make sense of an existence that grows more alien with each awakening. Some visit the chapter's librarium, accessing historical records in an effort to fill in the gaps in their own memories. Others stand vigil in the chapter's chapel, their massive forms dwarfing the altar as they offer silent prayers to the Emperor. There are accounts in the lore of Dreadnoughts communicating with each other during these periods, using the Vox network that connects the sarcophagi in the Stasis vaults to carry on conversations that the living Marines cannot hear. These exchanges, when they have been recorded, are among the most poignant documents in the chapter's archives. Two ancient warriors, each trapped in their own metal shell, sharing memories of battles fought and brothers lost, offering each other the only kind of companionship that their existence allows. The conversations are often fragmented, the participants' deteriorating memories making coherent dialogue difficult, but the emotional content shines through the confusion. They speak of faces they can no longer see clearly. They speak of sounds they can no longer hear. They speak of the cold and the dark and the long silence between awakenings. And they speak of the one thing that keeps them going. The stubborn, unkillable belief that their service still has meaning, that the Emperor still has need of them, that the sacrifice they have made and continue to make is worth the price. Whether this belief is justified is a question that the lore leaves deliberately open. Perhaps the Emperor does have a special place in his regard for the warriors who serve him from within the walking tombs of the Dreadnought. Perhaps the sacrifice is worth it, from a cosmic perspective that the individual pilot cannot perceive. Or perhaps the belief is simply a coping mechanism, a story the pilot tells himself to make the unbearable bearable, the mental equivalent of the amniotic fluid that keeps his body alive, something that sustains consciousness not because it is true, but because the alternative is despair. In the end, it may not matter. Well, whether the belief is justified or not, it serves its purpose. It keeps the pilot fighting, it keeps the Dreadnought marching, and in the grim darkness of the far future, that is all anyone can ask. Now let us talk about one more subject that deserves thorough attention, the weapons themselves. Because a Dreadnought is, at its most basic, a weapons platform, and the armaments it carries are among the most devastating portable weapons in the Imperium's arsenal. The assault cannon is perhaps the most iconic Dreadnought weapon, a rotary weapon that fires heavy-caliber rounds at an astonishing rate. Originally developed for use by Space Marine Terminators, the Dreadnought-mounted version is larger and more powerful, capable of shredding light vehicles and infantry with equal ease. The weapon's distinctive sound, and a high-pitched whine that builds to a thunderous roar as the barrels spin up to full speed, is one of the most recognizable battlefield sounds in the Imperium. For the pilot, firing the assault cannon is described as an intensely satisfying experience, one of the few sensations that pierces through the numbness of mechanical existence. The weapon responds to thought as naturally as a finger responds to will, each round a physical expression of the pilot's aggression, each burst a reminder that he still possesses the power to change the world around him, even if that world is filtered through sensors and data feeds. The twin-linked lascannon provides the Dreadnought with anti-armor capability at range, firing concentrated beams of laser energy that can slice through even the thickest plating. Yet the multi-melter generates a submolecular thermal beam that reduces its targets to their component atoms, effective at short range, but devastating against any kind of armor. The missile launcher offers flexibility, with frag missiles for anti-infantry work and crack missiles for armored targets. The plasma cannon harnesses the power of contained stellar reactions to blast enemies with superheated matter. The Power Fist, the Dreadnought's standard close combat weapon, is a marvel of engineering in its own right. Roughly the size of a small car, wrapped in a crackling energy field that disrupts the molecular bonds of anything it strikes, the Dreadnought Power Fist can crush reinforced concrete, tear through ceramite armor, and reduce living targets to unrecognizable pulp. For the pilot, using the Power Fist is both exhilarating and disturbing. The weapon responds to his will with the same responsiveness as his own hand once did, but the scale is completely different. Where once he might have crushed a skull with his armored gauntlet, now he crushes tanks. Where once he might have torn a door from its hinges, now he tears down walls. The power is intoxicating, and for some pilots, it is one of the few things that makes the Dreadnought's existence bearable. The Chain Fist is a variant of the Power Fist that incorporates a massive chainsaw blade into the design, adding grinding, ripping damage to the crushing force of the fist itself. It is particularly effective against fortifications and heavily armored vehicles. The chainsaw teeth biting into armor plating and tearing it apart from the inside while the power field disrupts the material's structural integrity. The sound of a Dreadnought's chain fist tearing through a bunker wall is said to be audible from kilometers away, a howling, grinding scream of metal on metal that serves as both a weapon and a psychological assault on the defenders within. Each of these weapons represents a different aspect of the Dreadnought's role on the battlefield, and a chapter's tech marines will configure each Dreadnought's loadout based on the expected threat and the individual pilot's preferences. A pilot who was known for aggressive close-quarters combat in his mortal life might be given 2 close combat weapons, turning his dreadnought into a berserker engine of melee destruction. A pilot who was a patient, less methodical tactician might be equipped with ranged weapons, allowing him to provide fire support from a position of relative safety. The configuration is not just a tactical decision. It is, in a small way, an acknowledgement of the pilot's identity, a recognition that the warrior inside the machine still has preferences, still has a personality, still has something that sets him apart from a simple, automated weapons platform. The Dreadnought's sensors and communication systems deserve mention as well, because they form the pilot's only interface with the outside world. The optical sensors provide visual data across multiple spectrums, from standard visible light to infrared and ultraviolet, with zoom capabilities that can pick out individual targets at extreme range. The audio pickups capture sound with a clarity and a range that far exceeds what organic ears can achieve, though the experience of hearing through sensors rather than ears is described as deeply unsettling for newly interred pilots. The Vox system allows the Dreadnought to communicate with other Marines, broadcasting the pilot's synthesized voice on tactical frequencies. And the Auspex, a sophisticated scanning system that can detect movement, heat signatures, and energy emissions through walls and over obstacles, provides the pilot with a level of battlefield awareness that no mortal warrior could match. All of these systems feed data directly into the pilot's brain through the neural interface, creating a composite picture of the battlefield that is simultaneously more detailed and less human than what the pilot experienced in life. The data is there, the information is complete and accurate, but it lacks the warmth, the immediacy, the emotional resonance of direct sensory experience. Seeing a sunset through optical sensors is not the same as seeing it with your own eyes. Hearing your brother's voice through audio pickups is not the same as hearing it through your own ears. The data tells you that the sun is setting and your brother is speaking, but it does not make you feel these things. It presents them as facts to be processed rather than experiences to be lived. This is the core of the Dreadnought's tragedy, stated once more in different terms. The machine preserves awareness while stripping away experience. It maintains consciousness while eroding meaning. Yes, it keeps the pilot alive in the most literal sense, while slowly killing everything that makes life worth living. And the pilot endures because endurance is all that remains, because duty is all that remains, because the stubborn, unkillable refusal to stop is the last human quality that the machine cannot take away. There is one more aspect of the Dreadnought experience that deserves our full attention before we bring this journey to its end, and it is perhaps the most visceral of all. We need to talk about what it actually feels like to fight inside one of these machines. Not the tactical overview, not the strategic implications, but the moment-to-moment sensory reality of combat, as experienced by a consciousness that is no longer human, but not quite machine. Imagine, if you can, waking from a sleep that lasted decades. The void recedes like dark water draining from a basin, and what rushes in to replace it is not sight or sound or touch as you once knew them. It is data. Pure, unfiltered, overwhelming data. Your optical sensors activate and suddenly you are seeing in 12 spectrums simultaneously. Visible light, infrared, ultraviolet, electromagnetic resonance, thermal imaging, motion tracking, all of it flooding into a brain that was designed by nature to process information from 2 small organic eyes. The tech priests have installed filters, of course, neural buffering systems that translate this torrent of input into something the organic mind can process. But the translation is never seamless. There are always artifacts, always moments where the sheer volume of incoming data creates a kind of sensory vertigo that has no equivalent in normal human experience. Your audio pickups engage next, and the world becomes a cathedral of sound. You can hear the heartbeat of the tech marine standing beside your sarcophagus. You can hear the servo motors in his augmetic arm whirring as he adjusts a diagnostic tool. You can hear the prayers of the chaplain, not just the words, but the subtle vibrations of his vocal cords, the minute clicks of his jaw, the air moving through his lungs. You can hear all of this, but you cannot feel the warmth of his breath or the weight of his hand upon your hull. The sounds arrive stripped of their human context. They're clinical and precise, and utterly devoid of the warmth that makes hearing a form of connection rather than merely a form of surveillance. Then the motor systems come online, and this is where the experience becomes truly strange. You think about moving your right hand, and somewhere beneath your consciousness, a neural interface translates that thought into a command that activates a hydraulic system that extends a mechanical arm, terminating in a weapon mount the size of a small vehicle. The movement happens, but the feedback is wrong. There is no proprioception, no natural sense of where your limbs are in space. Instead, there are position sensors and gyroscopic data and pressure readings that tell you, in precise numerical terms, exactly where your arm is and how much force it is exerting. You know these things with a precision that your organic body could never have matched, but you do not feel them. The difference between knowing and feeling is the distance between reading about a sunset and watching one, and that distance never closes, no matter how many centuries you spend inside the machine. Now imagine combat. The drop pod hits the ground and the assault ramps blow open, and suddenly you are there, on the battlefield, in the middle of whatever nightmare the galaxy has prepared for you this time. The data flood intensifies. Your targeting systems are painting dozens of contacts, each one tagged with threat assessments and engagement priorities and optimal weapon selections. Your tactical database is cross-referencing the current situation with thousands of previous engagements, looking for patterns, unidentifying weaknesses, calculating probabilities of success for different approaches. All of this happens in fractions of a second, faster than any organic brain could process, and the results are fed directly into your consciousness as something that feels less like thought and more like instinct. You advance. Each step sends tremors through the earth that your seismic sensors register as data points. The enemy opens fire, and you feel it. Not as pain, because pain requires nerve endings that you no longer possess, but as a series of impact notifications, tiny alerts in your awareness that tell you where you have been hit, how much damage has been sustained, whether any critical systems have been compromised. A heavy bolter round strikes your left pauldron and ricochets away. And you register this the way you might register a raindrop on an umbrella, a minor event, acknowledged and dismissed in the same instant. Your assault cannon spins up, and the sound fills your audio pickups with a roar that would deafen an unprotected human at 50 meters. But to you, it is just sound, processed and filtered and reduced to acceptable levels by systems designed to protect the fragile organic tissue that still constitutes the core of your being. You fire, and the recoil is absorbed by shock systems and gyroscopic stabilizers that keep your chassis stable within fractions of a degree. The shells leave the barrel at velocities that your sensors can track individually, each one a point of light on your trajectory display, each one connecting with a target that your systems have already moved past before the impact occurs. What the enemy falls, you advance, you fire again. The process repeats, and here is the thing that the lore touches on but rarely explores in full. Some pilots describe combat as the only time they feel anything approaching alive. The intensity of the data flood, the speed of the tactical calculations, the visceral satisfaction of watching targets disappear under your fire. All of this combines to create a state that is as close to excitement as the Dreadnought's existence allows. It is not joy. It is not thrill. It is not the adrenaline surge that once made your twin hearts race when the battle was joined. But it is something. A quickening of consciousness. A sense of purpose fulfilled. A reminder that you were built for this. That the machine that has consumed your body was designed for this exact function. and that in this moment, however briefly, you and the machine are one. The machine's purpose is your purpose. The machine's satisfaction is your satisfaction. And for those brief, thunderous hours, the gulf between what you were and what you have become narrows to almost nothing. It is after the battle that the gulf reopens. When the guns go silent and the enemy is destroyed and there is nothing left to shoot and nothing left to calculate and nothing left to do except exist inside the cold metal shell and wait for someone to come and shut you down. That is when the loneliness hits. That is when the silence becomes its own form of torment. That is when you realize that the closest thing to happiness you have felt in decades was the act of killing, and the implications of that realization are almost worse than the loneliness itself. This is the cycle. Sleep, wake, a fight, sleep again. And with each repetition, the gaps between the fighting, the moments of empty consciousness when there is nothing to distract you from what you have become, grow harder to bear, not because they are longer, but because they are emptier. Because with each awakening, there is a little less of you to fill them with. During the Horus Heresy, this cycle was compressed into something even more harrowing. The wars of that era were not the sporadic conflicts of the 41st millennium, separated by decades or centuries of stasis. They were continuous, relentless, grinding campaigns that lasted years without pause. Dreadnoughts who served during the Heresy were kept in a near-constant state of activation, awakened not for single battles, but for entire campaigns. Their consciousness maintained at operational levels for months or years at a time without the merciful interruption of stasis. The effect on the pilots was devastating. Without the periodic reset that stasis provides, the deterioration of the organic brain accelerated dramatically. Pilots who might have maintained coherent consciousness for centuries under normal conditions found themselves losing function within decades. Memory fragmented, personality eroded. The distinction between self and machine blurred until some pilots were no longer certain whether they were controlling the dreadnought or the dreadnought was controlling them. The Battle of Calth, where the word-bearers turned on the Ultramarines in one of the most devastating betrayals of the Heresy, saw some of the most intense dreadnought combat in recorded history. Ultramarines' contemptors clashed with word-bearers' contemptors in the caverns beneath the planet's surface, where the survivors of the initial betrayal had been driven by the orbital bombardment that had turned the surface into a radioactive wasteland. In those dark tunnels, the dreadnoughts fought with a ferocity that went beyond tactical necessity. They were not just fighting an enemy. They were fighting their own brothers, warriors who had once stood beside them, who had once shared their oaths and their purpose. The betrayal cut deep, even through the mechanical buffer of the dreadnought systems, and some of the Ultramarines' pilots reportedly had to be restrained after the battle to prevent them from continuing to attack already destroyed word-bearers' chassis. The drop site massacre at Istvan V was even worse. Yet the traitor legions had set a trap, luring the loyalist forces into a landing zone that was surrounded on all sides by hidden weapons batteries and concealed positions. When the trap was sprung, the loyalist forces were caught in a killing field from which there was virtually no escape. The dreadnoughts of the Salamanders, the Iron Hands, and the Raven Guard, the three legions that bore the brunt of the massacre, fought with desperate courage in a battle that was already lost. Many were destroyed outright, their sarcophagi breached by concentrated fire from weapons they had no way to evade. Others fought on long after their supporting infantry had been wiped out, standing alone against overwhelming odds, buying time for survivors to escape by refusing to fall. The Iron Hands lost nearly their entire dreadnought complement at Istvan V, a catastrophe that the chapter has never fully recovered from. Among the fallen was Cassiel, a contemptor dreadnought, whose last recorded Vox transmission was a simple repetition of a single phrase: "No retreat, no retreat, no retreat." His voice, according to the fragmentary records that survived, showed no emotion at all. Not defiance, not anger, not fear, just the flat, mechanical statement of a fact. He was not going to retreat. The machine would not allow it, and neither would the man inside. The Raven Guard's dreadnoughts fared little better. The Legion's emphasis on stealth and mobility made dreadnought deployment rare even under normal circumstances, and the few that were present at Ishtvan V found themselves in an environment that was uniquely hostile to their strengths. A dreadnought cannot sneak, cannot hide. It cannot use the shadows and the angles that the Raven Guard's doctrine depends on. They were exposed, visible, obvious targets in a killing field designed to destroy exactly their kind of threat. They fought and they died, and the Raven Guard's already small dreadnought roster was reduced to almost nothing. These Heresy-era battles established the template for how dreadnoughts would be used in the millennia that followed. The lessons learned at Calth and Istvan, and 100 other battles, were encoded into the tactical doctrine of every Loyalist chapter, shaping how dreadnoughts would be deployed, supported, and maintained for the next 10,000 years. The emphasis on keeping dreadnoughts in stasis between engagements, for instance, was at least partly a response to the observed deterioration of pilots who were kept active for extended periods during the Heresy. The practice of assigning heralds or keepers to serve as liaisons between the ancients and the living was born from the communication difficulties that plagued Heresy-era deployments, where newly awakened dreadnoughts sometimes mistook their own allies for enemies because they could not reconcile their fragmented memories with the current reality. The Heresy also established the dreadnought's role as a living symbol of continuity. In the aftermath of the Emperor's interment on the Golden Throne, when the Imperium was fracturing along lines of grief and recrimination, the surviving dreadnoughts became anchors of stability. They had been there, they had seen the Primarchs, and they had fought in the wars that had shaped the galaxy. Their testimony, however fragmented and unreliable, was the closest thing to first-hand history that the Imperium possessed. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, whose story we have already discussed, is the most famous example of this phenomenon, but he is far from the only one. Across the Imperium, in chapter fortresses and Mechanicum archives and inquisitorial vaults, the testimony of Heresy-era dreadnoughts has been collected, studied, argued over, and in some cases suppressed for 10,000 years. But there is a dark irony in this role. The very quality that makes Heresy-era dreadnoughts valuable as historical witnesses, their age, is also the quality that makes their testimony unreliable. After 10,000 years of stasis and awakening, of memory degradation and organic decay, the pilots of these ancient machines can no longer distinguish between what they actually experienced and what they have been told they experienced. Their memories have been overwritten, edited, corrupted, and reconstructed so many times that the original data, the actual lived experience of the Horus Heresy, is almost certainly lost. What remains is a palimpsest, a document that has been erased and rewritten over and over until the original text is visible only as faint traces beneath the accumulated layers of revision. And yet, the Imperium continues to revere these testimonies, to treat them as sacred records of the most important events in human history. Because what else can they do? The dreadnoughts are all they have. The alternative to flawed testimony is no testimony at all, and in a galaxy where history is used as a weapon, and where the control of narrative is a form of power, no testimony is the most dangerous option of all. This, perhaps, is the final and most profound lesson that the dreadnought teaches us. Memory is fragile. Identity is fragile. The things we believe about ourselves and our history are built on foundations that erode with time, that are shaped by the institutions that preserve them, that are altered by every retelling. The dreadnought knows this. He knows it better than anyone, because he has lived it, felt the memories slip away, felt the self dissolve, felt the narrative of his own life rewritten by forces beyond his control. And yet he persists. He holds on to whatever fragments remain, not because they are accurate, not because they are complete, but because they are his. they are all he has. And in a universe that takes everything, and having anything at all is a form of victory, there is another question worth exploring, one that the current era of the lore has introduced with the arrival of the Primaris Marines. Can a Primaris Marine be interred in a dreadnought? The answer, as it turns out, is complicated. And the complications tell us something important about the evolving nature of the Imperium and its relationship with its own technology. The Primaris Marines were created by Belisarius Cawl, the ancient Archmagos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, using enhanced gene seed and additional organ implants that make them taller, stronger, and more resilient than their firstborn predecessors. Cawl also developed new equipment specifically designed for the Primaris, including entirely new patterns of dreadnought. The Redemptor, the Brutalis, and the Ballistus were all designed from the ground up to accommodate Primaris physiology, with sarcophagi configured for the larger Primaris frame and neural interfaces calibrated for the additional organs that Primaris Marines possess. A firstborn Marine cannot pilot a Redemptor any more than a Primaris Marine can be interred in a classic Castroferrum chassis. The two are built for different bodies, different biologies, different wars. This technological divergence has created a quiet but significant cultural tension within many chapters. The firstborn dreadnoughts, the venerables who have served for centuries or millennia, represent a continuity with the chapter's past that the Primaris cannot match. They remember the old wars, the old ways. The chapter as it was before Guilliman's return and the introduction of the Primaris reinforcements. The Primaris dreadnoughts, by contrast, are new, their pilots drawn from the first generations of Primaris Marines to fall in battle, their experiences limited to the conflicts of the Indomitus era. There is a generational divide within the halls of the ancients that mirrors the divide within the chapter itself, old guard and new blood coexisting uneasily in a shared space, each representing a different vision of what it means to be a space marine. The Grey Knights, that most secretive and specialized of all the Imperium's military orders, maintain their own dreadnought traditions that deserve specific mention. Every Grey Knight is a powerful psyker, and this psychic ability does not disappear upon interment. A Grey Knight's dreadnought retains the ability to channel psychic energy through the machine's systems, using the sarcophagus as a focus for powers that can shatter minds and banish demons. The experience of using psychic powers through a mechanical chassis is described in the lore as profoundly disorienting, the warp energy flowing through circuits and conduits that were never designed to carry it, creating resonances and feedback loops that can drive the pilot to the brink of madness. But the Grey Knights endure, as they always have, because the alternative is to leave the Imperium's most dangerous enemies unchecked. The Death Watch, the Imperium's elite Xenos hunting force, draws its dreadnoughts from across all chapters, creating a unique situation where ancients from wildly different traditions and cultures find themselves serving side by side. A Space Wolf's dreadnought might fight alongside a Dark Angel's dreadnought, each bringing centuries of accumulated wisdom from traditions that are, in many respects, fundamentally incompatible. The Death Watch manages this diversity through strict protocols and a shared focus on the alien threat. But the underlying tensions are always present, adding yet another layer of complexity to an existence that is already almost unbearably complicated. These Deathwatch ancients carry with them the chapter cultures that shaped them, and when they speak to one another in the quiet hours between deployments, their conversations are windows into the vast diversity of the Space Marine experience. A Salamander's dreadnought speaks of fire and compassion. An Iron Hand's dreadnought speaks of logic and the purity of metal. A Blood Angel's dreadnought speaks carefully, always carefully, aware that the rage lurks just below the surface of every word. Together they form a chorus of voices that spans the breadth of the Imperium, each one singing the same song in a different key. Before we move toward our conclusion, there are several more threads of this story that deserve our attention. We have spoken at length about the Space Marine dreadnoughts of the Imperium and the corrupted abominations of the Chaos Legions. But the concept of the walking war machine, piloted by a living being, or the echo of one, extends beyond the borders of humanity's empire. Other races in the galaxy have developed their own equivalents, and examining them helps us understand what is unique about the dreadnought and what is universal about the concept it represents. The Eldari, the ancient race whose fall birthed the chaos god Slaanesh, and whose civilization once spanned the galaxy in an age when humanity was still crawling out of caves, have their own answer to the question of how a fallen warrior might continue to serve after death. But their answer is fundamentally different from the Imperium's, rooted not in technology, but in something far more intimate and far more profound. When an Eldari warrior dies, if they are fortunate enough to be wearing a spirit stone at the moment of death, their soul is captured within the stone rather than being devoured by Slaanesh in the warp. This stone can then be placed within the infinity circuit of a craft world, joining the collective consciousness of the dead, or it can be installed in a psychoplastic construct called a wraith construct. The Wraithguard and Wraithblades are infantry-sized versions of this concept, animated by the spirit of a dead Eldari warrior. But the largest and most powerful iteration is the Wraithlord, a towering construct that bears a striking superficial resemblance to a Space Marine dreadnought. The Wraithlord is, in many ways, the Eldari equivalent of the dreadnought. It is a large, bipedal war machine capable of mounting devastating weapons and engaging in close combat with terrifying effectiveness. It is piloted by the spirit of a dead warrior, channeled through the Wraithbone chassis by the psychic arts of the Eldari spirit seers, and like the dreadnought, yet the Wraithlord's pilot exists in a state that is profoundly different from the life they once knew. But here is where the comparison breaks down in revealing ways. The Eldari spirit within a Wraithlord is not physically present. There is no body, no brain, no organic tissue suspended in amniotic fluid. The pilot is a soul, a psychic imprint, drawn from the infinity circuit and given temporary form within the construct. The experience is described as deeply disorienting for the spirit, like waking from a dream to find yourself in a body that is not your own, in a world that seems muted and distant, like looking at reality through frosted glass. The spirit struggles to perceive the physical world through the Wraithlord's senses, and their actions are often sluggish and imprecise compared to the fluid grace of a living Eldari warrior. The critical difference is impermanence. An Eldari spirit can be returned to the infinity circuit after the battle is over, released from the Wraithlord's chassis, and allowed to rejoin the collective dead. They are not trapped permanently. They are borrowed, conscripted for a specific purpose, and then returned. This is still tragic, still a violation of the dead warrior's rest, and the Eldari spirit seers who perform the summoning do so with genuine reluctance and sorrow. But it is not the permanent, irreversible entombment that the dreadnought represents. The Wraithlord's pilot can go back. The dreadnought's pilot cannot. The Orc approach to the concept is, characteristically, far less philosophical and far more visceral. The Orc Death Dread is a massive, clanking war machine built from scrap metal, spare parts, and the sheer bloody-minded determination that defines Orc engineering. Inside, an Orc warrior has been hardwired into the machine's control systems, not because he was mortally wounded and deemed too valuable to lose, but because being piloted by a living Orc makes the Death Dread more effective than a purely mechanical automaton. The Orc pilot is not honored by the interment. He simply wanted to be the biggest and the most destructive thing on the battlefield, and being wired into a Death Dread achieves that goal. If the pilot goes mad from the experience, well, Orcs are already mad by human standards, so the difference is marginal at best. There are also the mech-boy-built killer cans, smaller walker machines that are piloted by Gretchen, the small cowardly servants of the Orc race who are forced into the machines against their will. Up for the Gretchen, internment in a killer can is a terrifying punishment dressed up as a reward. The big mech tells them they should be grateful for the chance to stomp around in a metal body, but the Gretchen inside know the truth. They are prisoners in a machine they barely understand, ordered to fight enemies that terrify them. And if they try to run, the machine's programming forces them forward anyway. It is a darkly comedic mirror of the Dreadnought's own situation, the same basic concept played for laughs rather than tragedy, but with an underlying cruelty that is no less real for being funny. The comparison between these different approaches to the same fundamental concept, how do you get a fallen warrior to keep fighting after their body has failed, reveals what is unique about the Space Marine Dreadnought. Yet the Eldari approach is temporary and reversible. The Orc approach is brutal but relatively simple. The Dreadnought approach is permanent, irreversible, and layered with ceremony and ideology that simultaneously honors and traps the warrior within. Only the Imperium manages to make the process both a genuine act of respect and a genuine act of cruelty at the same time. Only the Imperium wraps its consumption of its heroes in the language of gratitude and obligation, creating a situation where the victim cannot refuse without being seen as ungrateful, and cannot accept without surrendering everything that makes them who they are. This brings us to a figure we have not yet discussed, one whose story illuminates the Dreadnought experience from an angle that no other example quite matches: the Anchorite. The Anchorite is a loyalist word-bearer. Yes, you read that correctly. A member of the 17th Legion, the first legion to fall to chaos, who rejected the corruption of his Primarch Lorgar and remained loyal to the Emperor. His story is one of the most remarkable in the entire lore, and it intersects with the Dreadnought narrative in a way that adds yet another dimension to our understanding of what these machines represent. During the Battle of Calth, one of the bloodiest engagements of the Horus Heresy, the Word-bearers attacked the Ultramarines in a devastating surprise assault. In the midst of this carnage, the Anchorite, whose original name he later cast aside, realized that his legion's betrayal would lead only to an endless cycle of revenge and suffering. He surrendered to the Ultramarines. What an act of almost inconceivable courage given the circumstances. Amazingly, Rabut Gilliman himself decided to spare the penitent word-bearer, seeing in him something worth preserving. What makes the Anchorite's story particularly relevant to our discussion is what happened after his surrender. Racked with shame and guilt over his legion's betrayal, the Anchorite attempted to end his own life, but he was not permitted to die. Instead, he was interred within a dreadnought, his suicide attempt having wounded him critically enough to warrant the procedure. And from within that dreadnought, across the millennia that followed, the Anchorite became one of the most influential figures in the development of the imperial cult, the state religion that worships the emperor as a god. Think about what this means. A warrior who tried to kill himself out of shame was denied death and placed inside a machine that would keep him alive forever, forced to continue existing in the very state he had tried to escape. And then, from within that state of forced existence, he found a new purpose, building the religious framework that would eventually become one of the foundations of the Imperium itself. The Anchorite story is a story about what happens when the Dreadnought, that instrument of perpetual service, becomes a vehicle for something its creators never intended: personal redemption. The Anchorite chose to use his eternal imprisonment as an opportunity for atonement. He could not undo his legion's betrayal. He could not bring back the dead. But he could, from within his metal shell, work toward creating something that might give meaning to the suffering of those who had been lost. His involvement in the development of the imperial cult was conducted in secret. For obvious reasons, a known word-bearer, even a loyal one, could never be publicly associated with the Imperium's state religion. But his influence was real, his dedication absolute, and his story a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit within the Dreadnought's cold embrace. The Anchorite's tale also raises the uncomfortable question of whether Dreadnought internment might sometimes serve not as an honor, but as a way to manage inconvenient individuals. A loyalist word-bearer was politically dangerous, a living contradiction of the official narrative that the traitor legions were universally corrupt. Interring him in a dreadnought solved this problem neatly. He was alive but contained, his movements controlled, his access to others limited, his very existence kept secret from all but a trusted few. The Dreadnought served as both prison and preservation, keeping him alive for possible future use, while ensuring he could not cause problems in the meantime. This utilitarian approach to Dreadnought internment is not unique to the Anchorite's case. Throughout the lore, there are hints that chapters sometimes use the Dreadnought as a way to deal with warriors who are too important to kill, but too troublesome to have walking around freely. A Marine whose beliefs challenge the chapter's orthodoxy. A veteran whose memories include uncomfortable truths about the chapter's past. As a hero whose popularity threatens the authority of the current leadership. All of these can be managed by internment, by consigning the problematic individual to the Stasis vaults, where they will sleep away the centuries, awakened only when needed, and quickly return to sleep when the immediate crisis is over. It is a gentler version of what the Chaos Legions do openly, using the Dreadnought as a form of punishment, but it serves the same basic purpose: the control of inconvenient individuals. Now let us consider the Dreadnought's presence in the broader cultural landscape of Warhammer 40,000, because the concept has made a significant impact beyond the tabletop and the novels. The video game Space Marine 2, released to enormous commercial and critical success, featured a memorable Redemptor Dreadnought named Valtus as a major presence in the game's final chapter. Valtus bursts onto the screen with tremendous dramatic impact, his massive frame dwarfing the player characters as he tears through chaos forces with devastating efficiency. The game captures the visual spectacle of the Dreadnought perfectly, the weight of each step, the thunderous roar of weapons fire, the sheer unstoppable momentum of a multi-ton walking tank that cannot be slowed by anything short of concentrated anti-armor fire. But what makes Valtus's appearance particularly effective is the characterization. Even in the limited screen time the game gives him, Valtus comes across not as a mindless war machine, but as a personality, a warrior with his own voice and his own attitude. He asks where the rest of the traitors are, and he expresses frustration and aggression. He is, clearly, someone, not just something. And for players who may not be familiar with the deeper lore of the Dreadnought, this brief glimpse of the person inside the machine serves as an introduction to the concept's emotional depth, a hook that draws them into the richer material available in the novels and codices. The Dawn of War video game series also featured Dreadnoughts prominently, with Davian Thula's transformation from Space Marine captain to Dreadnought serving as one of the most emotionally resonant storylines in the second game. Players who had fought alongside Thule in the first game, who had come to know him as a competent and charismatic leader, were confronted with the reality of his new existence in ways that were both narratively effective and genuinely moving. Yet the confusion in his synthesized voice, the moments where he called living Marines by the names of the dead, the palpable sense of loss that surrounded every interaction with him. These representations in popular media are important because they introduce the Dreadnought concept to audiences who might never pick up a codex or read a Black Library novel. They serve as entry points into one of the richest and most emotionally complex aspects of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and they demonstrate that the concept's appeal extends far beyond the wargaming community that created it. The Dreadnought has also appeared in numerous audio dramas produced by Black Library, the publishing arm of Games Workshop. Yet these audio productions are particularly effective at capturing the Dreadnought experience because they can represent the pilot's synthesized voice in a way that printed text cannot. Hearing a once human voice reduced to a mechanical rasp, hearing the crackling distortion that comes with every word, hearing the weight of millennia in the cadence of a warrior's speech, these things have an emotional impact that is difficult to achieve on the printed page. The audio dramas also make effective use of sound design to convey the Dreadnought's sensory experience. The hum of servos, the whine of charging weapons, the distant, filtered quality of sounds heard through audio pickups rather than organic ears. On the tabletop itself, the Dreadnought has been a staple of Warhammer 40,000 since the game's earliest editions, the original Rogue Trader era. Dreadnoughts looked quite different from the models we know today, more like stumpy robots than the imposing war machines of current designs, but the core concept was already present. Over the decades, the Dreadnought model range has expanded enormously, from the classic Castroferrum kit to the massive Forge World Leviathan and Contemptor patterns, to the modern Primaris Redemptor, Brutalis, and Ballistus kits. Each new release has pushed the visual design forward while maintaining the essential identity of the Dreadnought, that distinctive silhouette that is instantly recognizable even to people who have never played the game. For hobbyists, the Dreadnought is one of the most rewarding models to build and paint. Its large, flat surfaces provide excellent canvases for freehand painting and weathering effects. Its modular weapon options allow for extensive customization, and its lore-rich nature means that every modeling choice, from the placement of purity seals to the wear patterns on the armor to the scroll bearing the pilot's name, can tell a story. Many hobbyists spend dozens or even hundreds of hours on a single Dreadnought model, building up layers of paint and detail that reflect centuries of battlefield service. The result is a model that is not just a game piece, but a character, a physical representation of a specific warrior's long and tragic story. The narrative gaming community has embraced the Dreadnought with particular enthusiasm. Campaigns and narrative events frequently feature Dreadnought characters as central figures, as their long lifespans and accumulated histories, making them ideal connecting threads between different phases of a multi-session campaign. A Dreadnought who was interred during the first session of a campaign can still be active in the final session, thousands of in-game years later, carrying the memories and the scars of every battle in between. This continuity gives narrative campaigns an emotional weight that purely competitive play lacks, and the Dreadnought is uniquely suited to provide it. There is something else about the Dreadnought that we should discuss before we close. Something that gets to the heart of why this concept continues to resonate with people across generations and across cultures. The Dreadnought is, at its core, a story about mortality. Not death, which is simple, but mortality, which is complex. But the Dreadnought exists in a state that is neither fully alive nor fully dead. A liminal zone where the boundaries between existence and non-existence, between self and other, between person and machine, are blurred beyond recognition. The pilot is alive in the sense that his brain functions and his consciousness persists. But he is dead in every other sense. Dead to the physical world. Dead to the pleasures and pains of embodied existence. Dead to the relationships and the routines that give ordinary life its texture and its meaning. This liminal state is deeply unsettling, and that is precisely its power. We as human beings are wired to think about life and death as binary states. You are either alive or you are dead. And the idea of something in between disturbs us at a fundamental level. The Dreadnought exploits this discomfort brilliantly, creating a character type that is both sympathetic and alien, both familiar and strange. We can relate to the Dreadnought's suffering, because we can imagine what it would be like to lose our bodies, our senses, our memories. But we cannot fully comprehend his experience because it is so far outside anything we have actually lived through. The Dreadnought is close enough to human to evoke empathy, but far enough from human to evoke awe. And that combination, empathy and awe, is what makes great science fiction characters. The Dreadnought also speaks to something specific about the current cultural moment, though this may not have been intended by its creators. We live in an age of increasing automation, where the line between human and machine is being steadily eroded. We carry computers in our pockets that know more about our habits and preferences than we do. We interact with artificial intelligences that can mimic human conversation with increasing fidelity. We are beginning to explore the possibilities of neural interfaces, of brain-computer connections that might one day allow us to control machines with our thoughts. The Dreadnought, conceived decades ago as a piece of dark science fiction, feels increasingly like a metaphor for anxieties that are becoming more and more relevant. What happens to our humanity when we become more machine than man? What happens to our identity when our consciousness is hosted by technology rather than by biology? What do we lose when we gain the power of the machine at the cost of the frailty of the flesh? These are questions that our own civilization is beginning to grapple with, however tentatively. The Dreadnought offers no answers, but it provides a framework for thinking about them. A thought experiment that pushes the implications of human-machine integration to their most extreme and most disturbing conclusions. And in doing so, it performs one of the most valuable functions that science fiction can perform. It helps us think about the future by showing us a version of it that is vivid enough to feel real and dark enough to serve as a warning. The Dreadnought is a warning, not against technology itself, but against the thoughtless application of technology, against the subordination of the individual to the machine, against the institutional willingness to consume human lives in pursuit of institutional goals. It warns us that power has a price, that preservation can be a form of destruction, that the line between saving someone and imprisoning them can be vanishingly thin. And it warns us that the most dangerous moment is not when we lose our humanity all at once, in a single dramatic catastrophe, but when we lose it gradually, one memory at a time, one sensation at a time, one piece of ourselves at a time, until we look inside and find that there is nothing left but the machine. That warning is worth hearing. In the grim darkness of our own future, however it unfolds, it is worth remembering that we are more than the sum of our mechanical parts, more than the weapons we wield, more than the wars we fight, more than the duties we perform. We are the choices we make, the feelings we preserve, the humanity we refuse to surrender, no matter how dark the path becomes. The Dreadnought knows this. Somewhere inside that cold sarcophagus, deep in the failing organic tissue of a brain that has endured for longer than any brain was ever meant to endure, the warrior, who was once a man, still knows this. And he holds on, because holding on is all he has left. And because, in the end, that is enough. It has to be. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40,000's most fascinating and heartbreaking concepts, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Leave me a comment with your thoughts, your favorite Dreadnought stories, or just to let me know you were here. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps the channel grow and allows me to keep making content like this. Until next time, sleep well, and may the Emperor protect.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.